There is a moment in every serious investigation when the evidence stops being interesting and starts being uncomfortable. That moment arrived quietly in a laboratory in Ontario, sometime in the early months of a winter that most people in the building would rather forget. A graduate researcher was reviewing ground-penetrating radar returns from a site near the northern edge of the Canadian Shield. She was supposed to be confirming the location of a flooded lower drift from the 1890s, something routine, something already accounted for in the old survey maps. Instead, the returns were showing her passages that ran the wrong direction, at the wrong depth, with geometric regularity that no known mining operation had ever produced. She flagged it. Her supervisor reviewed the data. He flagged it too. Then, for a period of time that nobody on the outside can quite account for, nothing happened. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and it genuinely fascinates me. Someone in Vancouver just getting into bed, someone in Quebec with the lights already off, someone in the middle of the prairies at a strange hour with this playing in the background. All of us pulled into the same quiet strangeness together. The Canadian Shield is the oldest exposed rock formation on the surface of the planet. Not the oldest in any poetic or approximate sense. The oldest in the literal, geologically verified, uranium lead-dated sense. Parts of the Shield, particularly in the region centred on what is now northern Ontario and western Quebec, contain rock that formed 2.7 billion years ago. Walk across certain outcrops near the town of Timmins on a clear day, and you are standing on something that existed before complex life invented itself on this planet, before fish, before trees, before insects, before almost everything that modern people would recognize as alive. The rock beneath your feet remembers a world that no living organism witnessed, and it has been sitting there, patient and dark, ever since. When European prospectors began arriving in serious numbers in the late 19th century, they found something that should have impressed them more than it did. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Cree, and the Haudenosaunee in the southern reaches, had known about certain mineral deposits for a very long time. Copper outcroppings near the northern lakes had been worked for at least 5,000 years. Archaeological surveys conducted throughout the 20th century repeatedly turned up evidence of systematic copper extraction predating European contact by millennia, in some cases by so many millennia, that the dates made reviewers uncomfortable enough to commission multiple rounds of confirmation testing. The copper was not just found and admired, it was extracted, processed, traded, and worked into objects that have been recovered from sites stretching across the entire eastern half of the continent. A piece of copper that began its life as an outcrop on the Canadian Shield could end up buried in a mound in Ohio, worked into an ornament in what is now Illinois, or shaped into a blade found near a burial site in Tennessee. The trade networks were real, they were sophisticated, and they required someone to know where the copper was and how to get it out. This should not be controversial. It is in the published archaeological literature, but what the published literature treats with considerably more caution is the question of depth. Surface copper is one thing, shallow extraction is another, but certain sites along the Shield, when surveyed with modern equipment, show evidence of extraction activity at depths that surface workings simply cannot explain. The town of Cobalt, Ontario, sits roughly 500 kilometers north of Toronto, in a landscape that still carries the visible scars of one of the most productive silver rushes in North American history. The rush began in 1903, when workers cutting a rail line for the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway found silver veins so rich that chunks of native silver the size of dinner plates were reportedly lying exposed on the surface. Within 2 years, the population of the area had gone from nearly 0 to over 10,000. Within a decade, Cobalt was producing silver in quantities that made it one of the most valuable mining districts on Earth. The town itself became a strange, compressed demonstration of early 20th century industrial ambition, a maze of headframes and shaft houses and rooming establishments built almost literally on top of each other, because the ore bodies ran so close to the surface that mines operated within city blocks of residences, and in at least 3 documented cases, within the basements of buildings that were still standing. What the Silver Rush miners found, besides silver, was something they did not fully understand and largely did not document. They found passages. Not their own passages, not passages that could be attributed to any prior industrial operation, because there had been no prior industrial operation in that district, at least not one that anyone had recorded. These passages were described in contemporary accounts with a consistency that makes dismissal difficult. They were narrow, in some cases barely wide enough for a man to move through sideways. They followed the silver veins with a precision that suggested whoever made them knew exactly where the ore was before they began. And they predated the railway workers by a period of time that the miners of 1903 could not plausibly estimate, because the rock around the passages had been resealed by mineral deposition in ways that take centuries, not decades. The accounts from those early years are scattered through a combination of mining company records, newspaper dispatches, and the kind of informal correspondence that engineers and foremen wrote to each other when they were trying to make sense of something unexpected. Most of this material has never been systematically compiled. Some of it has been lost to the fires and floods that periodically claimed the poorly built archives of boomtowns. But enough survives to establish a pattern. Strange passages, older than anything European, following the ore. The first modern systematic attempt to address the pre-contact mining question at Cobalt came not from archaeologists, but from geologists, which is perhaps why it received so little public attention. A geological survey conducted in the 1970s as part of a broader Ontario government assessment of the district's residual mineral potential included, almost as an afterthought, a section on anomalous void spaces identified during the survey. The report described 14 distinct void spaces whose geometry and position could not be explained by known historical mining activity. It noted that the mineralogical characteristics of the rock immediately adjacent to these spaces suggested they had been open, that is, not filled with rock or mineral debris, for a period significantly predating European contact. The report recommended further investigation. No further investigation was conducted, at least not one that produced a public document. 30 years later, a different survey was conducted using technology that did not exist in the 1970s. Ground-penetrating radar had by then become sophisticated enough to map subsurface features, with resolution measured in centimeters at depths of several meters, and with progressively coarser but still useful resolution at greater depths. The survey team was a collaboration between a university geology department and a private mineral exploration company, the kind of partnership that is common in Canadian resource development, and that sometimes produces interesting results without anyone particularly intending to produce interesting results. The team was looking for economic mineral deposits. What they found, at a site roughly 3 kilometers from the original silver discovery, was a network of passages extending to a depth of approximately 40 meters, arranged in a pattern that one member of the team, in an email that was later quoted in a trade publication, described as looking like something had been planned. Planned is a significant word in this context. Natural voids in rock, whether formed by dissolution, by gas bubbles in ancient lava, by differential stress fracturing, or by any of the other mechanisms that create underground space without human assistance, do not look planned. They are irregular, discontinuous, variable in cross-section, and they follow the path of least resistance rather than the path of the ore. The passages identified in the 2000 survey were none of these things. They were consistent in cross-section, a roughly oval form approximately 60 centimeters wide and 90 centimeters tall, give or take variations that could plausibly be attributed to the difficulty of working in hard rock without steel tools. They followed the silver veins. They connected at junctions that appeared intentional rather than accidental, and they maintained a roughly constant relationship to the surface, descending at grades that, if you did not know where you were looking, you might describe as engineered. The question of who made these passages, assuming they are artificial, which the geological evidence suggests but does not yet definitively confirm, requires a detour through a history that most Canadians encounter only in fragments. Pre-contact copper, working in the Great Lakes region, is one of the most thoroughly documented aspects of North American archaeology, and also one of the most thoroughly ignored aspects of popular history. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call it, was a tradition of copper extraction and working that began approximately 7,000 years ago in what is now Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and the adjacent parts of Canada. and that continued in various forms for roughly 5,000 years. The people who participated in this tradition extracted copper from surface outcroppings and from shallow deposits, worked it by cold hammering and annealing into an extraordinary range of objects, and distributed those objects through trade networks that connected communities across enormous distances. What is less often discussed is the evidence that old copper complex extraction was not always shallow. At certain sites on the Keweenaw Peninsula in Michigan, which sits across Lake Superior from the Canadian deposits, archaeological investigation has revealed mining pits that reached depths of several meters, and that, in the deeper examples, required the removal of rock in quantities that could only have been accomplished through systematic, organized effort sustained over extended periods. These are not scratches on the surface. These are excavations, real excavations, conducted by people who understood where the copper was, how to get to it, and how to organize collective labor to accomplish that goal. The Michigan sites are well documented. The Canadian sites are considerably less so, partly because the Canadian copper deposits attracted less archaeological attention in the 20th century, partly because the overlying industrial mining of the late 19th and early 20th centuries destroyed or obscured much of the surface evidence, and partly because the question of deep pre-contact extraction touches on issues of indigenous sovereignty and intellectual property that made some researchers cautious about the conclusions their data suggested. There is a site approximately 80 kilometers northeast of Cobalt that has appeared in exactly 3 published papers over the past 40 years and has never been the subject of sustained archaeological investigation. The site was first noted by a prospector in the 1950s who reported finding what he described as old workings while following a copper stringer across a rocky hillside. He filed a claim, found the copper extension economically marginal, and abandoned both the claim and the report of the old workings without following up. The report ended up in the Ontario Ministry of Northern Development and Mines archive, where it sat for 40 years before a graduate student researching the history of pre-contact metalworking came across it. The graduate student, whose work was later published in the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, made 2 visits to the site. On the first visit, she confirmed that the feature the prospector had described was real, that it was not a natural void, and that it showed evidence of human modification in the form of tool marks on the walls and a roughly level floor that natural rock dissolution does not produce. On the second visit, she attempted to trace the feature further into the hillside and found that it continued beyond the range of her equipment, which at the time consisted of a measuring tape, a flashlight, and a geological compass, and that it appeared to connect, at some distance, with a second feature running at an angle to the first. She noted all of this in her paper and recommended systematic investigation. The paper was cited 4 times in the following decade, all 4 citations appearing in bibliographies rather than in substantive discussions. No systematic investigation was conducted. The ground-penetrating radar survey that began circulating in restricted geological circles in the early 2020s was different from previous efforts in several ways. The most important difference was scale. Previous surveys had examined individual sites or small areas. This survey covered a corridor approximately 40 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide, running northeast from the Cobalt district along what geologists call the Cobalt embayment, a structural feature of the shield that concentrates certain types of mineral deposits and that happens to coincide with a high density of pre-contact archaeological sites in the surrounding region. The survey identified what the principal report describes as 37 discrete subsurface anomalies consistent with artificial void spaces. Of these, 12 showed the geometric characteristics that distinguish human-made passages from natural features. Of the 12, 8 were grouped in a pattern that, when mapped, suggested not a collection of independent workings but something more coherent, a connected system. Passages that were not merely near each other, but that related to each other in ways that implied a common plan. The report was circulated to a small number of geological institutions and government offices. It was not published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was not released to the public. The reason given, in the covering letter that accompanied the restricted distribution, was that additional verification was required before public release. That was in 2021. As of the time this script was written, no peer-reviewed publication had appeared, and no public statement had been issued by any of the institutions that received the report. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Canada's oldest mines actually represent in the history of the continent. The popular narrative of Canadian mining history begins with European contact. The French fur traders of the 17th century noticed copper near the shores of Lake Superior and mentioned it in their reports. The British colonial administrators of the 18th century commissioned surveys of mineral resources in the territories they controlled. The great mineral rushes of the 19th century, silver at Cobalt, nickel at Sudbury, gold at Kirkland Lake, and Timmins and Red Lake, are treated as the beginning of the story, the point at which serious extraction began. But this framing requires you to ignore several thousand years of documented activity. The copper that European explorers found near Lake Superior was not lying untouched in a landscape untouched by human hands. The outcrops that produced the richest copper had been worked. The surrounding forests showed the marks of fire management practiced over generations. The waterways along which the copper moved had been travelled so extensively that the portage routes were worn into the landscape with a permanence that the first European travellers recognised immediately and used for their own transportation. The question is not whether pre-contact mining happened. It did. The question is how extensive it was, how deep it went, and who organised it. There is a body of oral tradition among the Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes region that speaks specifically about underground places, about passages beneath the earth, about ancestors who knew things about what lay below the surface, that the surface itself did not reveal. These traditions have been treated, with some exceptions, as spiritual or metaphorical content by the researchers who have encountered them, placed in the category of cosmological narrative rather than historical testimony. This categorization deserves examination. Oral traditions in North American indigenous cultures served, among other functions, the function of recording and transmitting practical information across generations. The ethnobotanical knowledge encoded in oral traditions has been repeatedly validated by biochemical analysis. The ecological knowledge encoded in oral traditions has been repeatedly validated by biological survey. The astronomical knowledge encoded in oral traditions has been repeatedly validated by archaeoastronomical investigation. There is no principled reason to assume that the geographic and geological knowledge encoded in oral traditions is categorically different from these other forms of knowledge. When Anishinaabe elders describe underground passages in specific geographic areas, using descriptions that are consistent across communities that have been separated from each other for centuries, and when geological survey in those same areas identifies features consistent with those descriptions, the convergence is worth taking seriously. This does not mean that every element of every oral tradition is literal historical testimony. It means that the relationship between oral tradition and physical evidence is more complex than the simple dismissal of one in favor of the other would suggest. The copper trade of pre-contact North America was one of the great economic systems of the ancient world, and it is almost entirely absent from the way that history is taught in Canadian and American schools. At its peak, roughly 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, raw copper and finished copper objects moved through exchange networks that connected communities from the Gulf of Mexico to Hudson Bay, from the Atlantic coast to the Great Plains. The quantities involved were not trivial. Archaeological sites associated with what researchers call the Middle Woodland tradition, roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, have produced copper artifacts in numbers that imply not occasional gift exchange, but sustained, organized production for a market, or at least for something that functioned like a market. Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio, among the most intensively studied archaeological complexes in North America, have yielded copper artifacts by the thousands, objects made from Canadian shield copper, worked to a standard of quality that required skilled artisans, exchanged across distances that required organized logistics, and deposited in quantities that required sustained supply chains. The copper did not walk itself from northern Ontario to central Ohio. It was extracted by people who knew where it was. It was transported by people who knew the routes. It was worked by people who understood the material. And at every stage of this process, there were organizational structures, decision-making frameworks, and institutional knowledge that persisted across generations. None of this required cities. None of it required writing. But it did require something that European observers, arriving centuries after the system had been disrupted by disease and displacement, consistently failed to recognize sophistication. The specific question of underground passages, as opposed to surface or near-surface extraction, connects to a technical debate that has been running in archaeology for several decades without reaching a widely accepted resolution. The debate concerns the extent to which pre-contact North American miners worked at depth. The argument against deep pre-contact mining rests on several points. Steel tools, the argument goes, are necessary for efficient deep rock extraction. Pre-contact miners had copper tools and stone mauls, adequate for surface work, but limited in their ability to fracture hard rock at depth. The organizational requirements for deep mining, ventilation, lighting, systematic removal of debris, structural support of shafts and tunnels are considerably greater than those for surface extraction and would require a level of institutional complexity that some researchers find implausible for pre-contact societies in the region. And the direct evidence for deep extraction, as opposed to surface or shallow working, has been contested on the grounds that the features identified as deep pre-contact workings could, in theory, be explained by other means. The argument for deep pre-contact mining rests on equally specific points. Copper tools, particularly copper chisels and wedges used with stone mauls, are demonstrably effective for working softer rock types, including some of the rock types that characterize the mineral-bearing formations of the Canadian Shield. Fire setting, the practice of building fires against rock faces and then quenching them rapidly to cause thermal fracturing, was documented by early European observers as a technique in use among indigenous miners and has been experimentally demonstrated to be highly effective for deep extraction in rock types that respond to thermal stress. The organizational requirements, while real, are not beyond the demonstrated capacity of the communities that organized the Hopewell exchange system, or the communities that built the earthworks at Poverty Point in Louisiana, or the communities that constructed the elaborate ceremonial centers of the Mississippi Valley. And the direct evidence, however contested, keeps accumulating. In 2019, a team of researchers from Laurentian University and the University of Waterloo conducted a small-scale survey at a site in the Temagami district of northeastern Ontario, about 100 kilometers north of Cobalt, using a combination of ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and seismic reflection profiling. The site had been identified by a local Anishinaabe community as an area of cultural significance, whose specific nature the community preferred not to disclose in advance of the survey, wanting first to understand what the survey would find. The survey found voids, 4 of them, at depths ranging from 8 to 23 meters, in a geological formation that the seismic data confirmed was not subject to the natural void-forming processes that sometimes complicate interpretation in carbonate rocks. The voids were not connected to each other in the survey data, but the survey team noted that the survey area was limited and that the spatial arrangement of the 4 voids was consistent with connection at depths or in locations outside the survey footprint. The community, after reviewing the results, asked that the specific location of the site not be published. The researchers respected this request. The published paper described the methodology and general findings without providing coordinates or enough geographic detail to allow the site to be located by outsiders. The paper was not widely read outside the specialist literature, but it established, in the peer-reviewed record, that subsurface voids of potentially artificial origin exist in the Temagami district at depths consistent with the passage network described in the restricted 2021 survey. The restricted 2021 survey had a complicated origin. It was commissioned by a private mineral exploration company that was assessing the residual potential of the cobalt embayment, using modern geophysical methods to look for ore bodies that conventional prospecting had missed. The principal researcher was a geophysicist with substantial experience in mineral exploration, not in archaeology, and when the data began showing features inconsistent with ore bodies, he initially categorized them as geological noise and set them aside. It was a colleague reviewing the raw data who first suggested that the features might be something other than noise. The colleague had a background in underground civil engineering and recognized certain geometric regularities in the returns as characteristic of built rather than natural spaces. The two of them spent several months working through the data before concluding that they had found something that required expertise outside their fields. The involvement of archaeologists came later, and it came through channels that were not entirely comfortable for anyone involved. The Mineral Exploration Company had no obvious interest in archaeological findings. Archaeological findings on a mineral exploration tenement can, under Ontario law, trigger reviews that complicate or delay development. The researchers were in the position of having found something significant using tools paid for by an organization that had reason to wish the finding had not been made. The decision to distribute the report, even on a restricted basis, was the result of negotiations that the principal researcher has described in a recorded conversation that has been shared with a small number of journalists, but not published, as genuinely difficult. There was pressure, he said, to simply reclassify the anomalies as geological features and move on. The fact that the report was distributed at all reflects the judgment of several people in the chain of review that what they had found was too significant to quietly reclassify. To understand what a passage network at this scale would mean, it helps to think about analogies from other parts of the world, where pre-industrial underground mining has been accepted as historical fact, without the resistance that similar evidence faces in North America. The ancient copper mines of Wales, in particular the site at Great Orme on the northern coast of Wales, are among the best documented examples of large-scale pre-industrial underground mining in the world. Excavations at Great Orme, beginning in the 1980s, revealed a network of passages extending to depths of 70 meters and covering a total passage length of over 8 kilometers, created during the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 to 3,000 years ago, without metal tools of any kind. The miners at Great Orme used fire setting, stone mauls, and bone and antler picks to extract copper ore in quantities that supplied a substantial portion of the Bronze Age copper trade in northwestern Europe. The scale of the operation and the organizational capacity it required is now well established. There is no serious scholarly dispute that Bronze Age people in Wales organized and executed large-scale underground mining operations without steel tools. The question of why similar evidence in North America generates resistance, while similar evidence in Europe is straightforwardly accepted, is one that several researchers have raised without receiving satisfying answers. The most charitable explanation is that the European evidence is simply better documented, having been subject to sustained archaeological investigation for longer. The less charitable explanation is that there is a persistent assumption, not always conscious, that the pre-contact populations of North America were less organizationally sophisticated than their contemporaries in Europe and the Near East, and that evidence challenging this assumption generates resistance. That evidence consistent with it does not. What has actually been found in the recent LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar surveys goes beyond the question of depth. The feature that most distinguishes the cobalt embayment passage network from simple deep extraction is the evidence of connectivity. Individual mine shafts or pits, regardless of depth, are discrete features. What the survey data appears to show is not discrete features but a connected system, passages that relate to each other spatially in ways that suggest not independent operations at different times but a single, planned complex. If the interpretation is correct, the implications extend beyond the question of who made the passages. A connected underground network implies organizational capacity of a different order from individual pit mining. Someone had to plan the connections, which means someone had a conception of the whole system before work on any part of it began. Someone had to coordinate the labor of multiple working faces progressing toward each other in 3 dimensions underground, which requires surveying, or something that functions like surveying, because without an accurate understanding of where you are relative to where you want to be, underground work rapidly becomes a maze of blind ends. Someone had to manage ventilation, because a connected network without ventilation management is a network that quickly fills with the products of combustion from fire-setting operations and the respiration of workers. None of this is impossible for pre-contact North American societies, but it is beyond what most published accounts of pre-contact North American mining have attributed to them. The question is whether the attribution has been limited by evidence or by assumption. There is a document in the Library and Archives Canada collection, filed under a designation that places it in the miscellaneous correspondence of the Department of Indian Affairs for the years 1907 to 1912, that has not to the best of current researchers' knowledge, been transcribed, cited, or digitized. The document is described in the finding aid only as Field Report, Mineral Resources, Temiskaming District, 1908, author unspecified. The document itself is a handwritten report from what appears to be a government surveyor or agent who visited the Cobalt District and surrounding area in the summer of 1908 at the height of the Silver Rush. The handwriting is legible but not professionally trained, suggesting a practical man rather than a trained scientist. The content is a mixture of observations about current mining activity, observations about the terrain and geology, and, occupying roughly a quarter of the document, observations about what the author calls marks of old workings of Indian origin that he encountered at several locations in the district. The author describes, at one location he identifies as being some miles north and east of the railway, features that sound consistent with the subsurface passages described in the modern surveys. He mentions that the features ran into the ground at an angle and that he followed one of them as far as a lamp permitted, which he estimated was about 30 feet, before the air became bad. He describes the walls of the feature as smooth, in a way that rock does not naturally become, and he describes a junction, a point where two passages met, which he found disturbing because it was not, in his word, accidental. The document then returns to a discussion of conventional mining activity and does not come back to the old workings. The author does not appear to have reported his observations to his superiors in any formal way, or if he did, the formal report has not been found. Archival material of this kind, fragmentary, unofficial, scattered across collections that were not organized with research in mind, is the connective tissue of historical investigation. The document in Library and Archives Canada is not proof of anything. It is one data point among many, a contemporary observation that is consistent with the modern survey data, and that predates by over a century any possibility of the modern survey influencing the author's interpretation of what he saw. There are more documents of this type than most people realize. The archival collections of the Canadian government, the Ontario provincial government, the railway companies that opened the north, and the mining companies that exploited it contain enormous quantities of unindexed and undigitized material from the period of initial European penetration of the Shield, and that material includes, scattered through correspondence and field reports and inspection records, repeated references to features that do not fit the official narrative of a landscape untouched by organized human activity before European arrival. Most of these references have never been followed up. They sit in boxes that researchers do not know to open because the finding aids do not tell them what is inside. The few that have been followed up have, with some consistency, pointed toward the same conclusion that the geological surveys are pointing toward, that the Canadian Shield was the site of organized, sustained, deep extraction mining activity long before the railway workers of 1903 found their silver. The Sudbury Basin, 200 kilometers west of Cobalt, is the site of what is now one of the most intensively mined areas in the world, a region whose nickel and copper deposits are so vast that they are believed to have been created by a meteorite impact 85 billion years ago that excavated a crater 60 kilometers across and created mineral concentrations that are still being extracted more than a century after European mining began. The Sudbury mines have produced more nickel than any other source in history. They have also, as a consequence of that production, obliterated any evidence of pre-contact activity that may have existed in the immediate vicinity of the deposits. But the surrounding region tells a different story. The Anishinaabe peoples whose territories encompass the Sudbury area have traditions of copper extraction that predate European contact by millennia and that describe both the location of deposits and the methods used to work them with a few specificity that does not suggest purely surface activity. Archaeological surveys conducted in the less disturbed areas around the basin have found evidence of pre-contact copper working at multiple sites, including one site where the working debris includes fragments consistent with underground extraction rather than surface collection. What happened to the evidence that was directly beneath the modern mine workings is a question that has no good answer. The industrial excavations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries went deep, fast, and with no interest in archaeological preservation. If there were pre-contact passages beneath the Sudbury Basin, similar to those suggested by the cobalt embayment data, the evidence is now irretrievably buried under or mixed into the debris of industrial mining at a scale that makes separation impossible. The question of what technology was used to create the passages, if they are artificial, is one that geologists and archaeologists have approached from different directions without quite meeting in the middle. The geological evidence that the passages are artificial rests primarily on the geometric characteristics of the features, characteristics that are consistent with human modification and inconsistent with the natural processes that form voids in shield rock. These processes, principally differential fracturing along zones of geological weakness, produce features that are irregular, discontinuous, and geometrically unconstrained. They do not produce features with consistent cross-sections, consistent relationships to ore bodies, and organized junctions. But saying a feature is artificial does not immediately tell you how it was made. Shield rock is extremely hard, among the hardest rock types in the world, and working it without steel tools requires either very large quantities of labor applied over very long periods, or specific techniques that exploit vulnerabilities in the rock's structure. Fire setting is the most important of these techniques. It was documented in use among indigenous miners at the copper deposits of Lake Superior by early European observers and has been extensively tested experimentally. The procedure involves building a fire against the working face, allowing it to burn long enough to superheat the rock to several hundred degrees, and then either allowing the rock to cool rapidly by introducing cold water, or simply allowing the differential thermal expansion and contraction to fracture the rock internally. Done correctly, fire setting can advance a working face in hard rock at rates that are surprisingly competitive with early industrial drilling and blasting, particularly in rock types, like the mineralized zones of the shield, where the ore-bearing rock is often softer than the surrounding country rock. The evidence for fire setting in the cobalt passages, if the passages are indeed pre-contact, would be the presence of fire-reddened rock surfaces and charcoal residue in the walls and floor of the passages. Ground-penetrating radar cannot detect these features. Physical investigation of the passages, including sampling and radiometric dating of any charcoal, would be required to establish this. That physical investigation has not yet been conducted. There is a parallel investigation underway, separate from the geophysical surveys, that approaches the problem from the direction of the ore bodies themselves. The question this investigation is asking is not where the passages are, but what was taken from them and when. The technique being used is uranium-lead dating of secondary mineral formations in known pre-contact archaeological sites and in the geological context of the cobalt embayment ore bodies. The logic is as follows. When copper or silver is extracted from a deposit and the surrounding rock is exposed to air and water, it triggers a series of chemical reactions that produce new mineral phases in the immediate vicinity of the extraction. These secondary phases form on timescales that can be constrained by radiometric methods. If the secondary phases in the ore bodies of the embayment cluster, in age, around a period consistent with known pre-contact cultural activity, it is evidence that extraction was occurring during that period. If they cluster around the dates of European industrial mining, it is evidence that significant prior extraction did not occur. Preliminary results from this investigation, which have been presented at a geological conference in 2022 but have not yet appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, suggest that some of the secondary mineral formations in the cobalt embayment ore bodies are significantly older than European contact. The preliminary dates range from roughly 500 to roughly 3,000 years before present. The researchers involved have been careful to note that the methodology is not yet fully validated for this specific geological context, and that alternative explanations for the old dates have not been fully excluded. But the direction of the evidence is consistent with the direction of the geophysical evidence. A researcher who has spent several years working at the intersection of Anishinaabe, traditional knowledge and geological survey data, and who asked not to be identified by name because the community she works with has not made a decision about public disclosure, described the experience in terms that are worth considering carefully. She said that when she first began bringing geological data to elders in the community she works with, she expected to find that the traditional knowledge would have to be reconciled with the geological data, that there would be gaps or discrepancies that would need to be managed diplomatically. Instead, she found the opposite. The traditional knowledge was, in her description, more detailed than the geological data in some respects, describing features that the geophysical surveys had not yet reached, and providing contextual information about those features that the geological record alone could not supply. She gave one example that she was willing to share publicly. An elder described a specific underground feature, its orientation, its approximate depth, and the geological formation it was associated with enough precision that the description could be located on a map within a few hundred meters. The feature had not been identified in any published geological survey. When a ground-penetrating radar survey was subsequently conducted at the location indicated by the elder's description, a subsurface void was identified at approximately the depth and orientation described. The elder was not surprised by this. The researcher was. The institutional responses to the evidence that has accumulated over the past 2 decades range from genuine engagement to sustained disinterest to what can only be described as active avoidance. Understanding this range of responses requires understanding the institutional context in which Canadian mining archaeology operates. Ontario and the federal government of Canada have legal frameworks that require consultation with Indigenous communities before mineral development on lands subject to treaty rights or traditional use claims. These frameworks have been strengthened significantly in recent decades, particularly following the Supreme Court of Canada's decisions on the duty to consult. In practice, however, the archaeological assessment required before mineral development is conducted by companies hired by the development proponent under standards set by the province, and with an institutional focus on identifying and managing archaeological constraints on development, rather than on advancing archaeological knowledge. This system does not produce systematic investigation of the kind that the Cobalt Embayment Passage Network would require. It produces site-specific assessments, conducted quickly and under budget pressure, that are designed to establish whether a specific development proposal will disturb specific known or potential archaeological sites. It is not designed to answer the question of whether a 40-kilometer corridor contains a connected underground network created by pre-contact miners, because that is not the question the system is designed to ask. The researchers who want to ask that question have to do so with resources that are modest compared to the resources available to the mineral development industry, and with institutional frameworks that provide little support for the kind of sustained, multidisciplinary, multi-year investigation that the question requires. There is a broader context to the cobalt embayment data that connects it to a growing body of evidence from other parts of Canada and the northern United States. The question of pre-contact mining at depth is not limited to the cobalt embayment. It appears in various forms and with various degrees of documentation at multiple sites across the Canadian Shield and the adjacent territories. At Isle Royale in Lake Superior, which is now part of Michigan but whose geology connects it to the Canadian Shield, archaeological investigations have documented pre-contact copper mining pits reaching depths of 9 meters, significantly deeper than surface extraction, with evidence of systematic organization across a site area of several square kilometers. The Isle Royale sites have been dated to a period beginning approximately 5,000 years ago and continuing, with fluctuations, for several thousand years. The scale of the operation, estimated from the volume of extracted material and the number of identified pits, implies a sustained industry rather than occasional extraction. At Marathon, on the northern shore of Lake Superior in Ontario, a site investigated in the 1990s produced evidence of copper extraction at depths of up to 6 meters across an area extensive enough to require, by the investigators' estimates, organized labor at a scale consistent with a substantial permanent or semi-permanent population in the area during the period of extraction. The Marathon site has received relatively little attention in the years since the original investigation. At Wawa, also in northern Ontario, historical accounts from early European travellers describe Indigenous guides leading them past features described as holes in the earth, with the marks of working about them, features that the guides treated as significant enough to mention, but not significant enough to dwell on, as if the existence of such features were common knowledge, requiring no explanation. The 2021 restricted survey is not the only recent geophysical work in the region. A separate survey, conducted by an academic team with funding from a research council grant, covered a smaller area in the southern cobalt embayment and used a somewhat different methodological approach, combining ground-penetrating radar with magnetic susceptibility mapping. Magnetic susceptibility mapping can identify areas of rock where the magnetic properties have been altered by heating, which is relevant because fire setting, if used extensively in a location, leaves a distinctive magnetic signature in the surrounding rock. The academic survey identified magnetic anomalies at 3 locations within its survey area. At 2 of these locations, the anomalies were consistent with natural explanations, specifically with the presence of magnetite-bearing rocks of known geological character. At the 3rd location, the anomaly was more complex, showing a pattern that the survey team described as consistent with localized, intense, repeated heating of a specific area of rock, rather than with the broad geological magnetism of the surrounding formation. This pattern is what fire-setting archaeology would predict if fire setting had been used intensively at that location. The 3rd location overlaps at a distance of approximately 300 meters with one of the anomalies identified in the 2021 restricted survey. The 2 surveys were conducted independently, using different methods by teams with no knowledge of each other's work at the time of fieldwork. The question of why this story is not more widely known has a complicated answer that involves not a single act of suppression, but a system of institutional indifference that is, in some ways, more effective than deliberate suppression because it is harder to identify and challenge. The geophysical data is real. The archival documents are real. The geological evidence for pre-contact alteration of the ore body environments is real. The archaeological evidence from Isle Royale and related sites is published and peer-reviewed. None of this has been hidden in the sense of being locked away by a specific decision to conceal it. It has been produced by researchers working in appropriate professional settings, submitted to appropriate venues, and then not followed up in ways that would draw it into a coherent narrative. This is how the pre-contact history of the Canadian Shield has been managed for most of the period since European contact, not through a specific decision to suppress it, but through a diffuse institutional orientation that treats it as less important than the economic geology of the same region. The result is a body of evidence that is technically available but practically invisible to anyone who is not specifically looking for it and who does not know where to look. Some researchers argue that this is changing. The strengthening of Indigenous rights frameworks, the increasing integration of traditional knowledge into resource management processes, and the growing recognition within archaeology that North American pre-contact societies were more organizationally complex than older models assumed, all point toward conditions that are more favorable for serious investigation of the cobalt embayment and related sites than existed even a decade ago. The person who first circulated the restricted 2021 survey outside the original distribution list has never been publicly identified. Someone sent copies of the report to 3 journalists and 2 archaeologists, using an anonymous email account that was subsequently deactivated. The journalists were unable to publish the full report because they could not independently verify its authenticity, and because the source, without a name, could not be protected in the usual journalistic sense. One of the archaeologists who received a copy was able to verify its authenticity through contacts at one of the institutions listed in the distribution record. That archaeologist subsequently discussed the report in a recorded podcast that reached a relatively small audience of specialists. The podcast episode was not removed or suppressed. It simply did not receive the attention that would have been necessary to drive it into broader public circulation. The report itself describes, in the dry technical language of geological survey, something that is extraordinary. A connected underground network in Canada's oldest mining district, whose origin cannot be explained by any known historical operation, and whose characteristics are consistent with pre-contact human construction at a scale that would require rethinking the organizational capacity of the societies that inhabited the region before European contact. That sentence does not appear in the report in those terms. The report is a technical document that describes anomalies, notes their characteristics, and recommends further investigation. But that is what the evidence adds up to when you follow every thread. What physical investigation of the passages would require is an interdisciplinary effort of a kind that Canadian archaeological practice is not currently set up to execute quickly. It would require engagement with the Anishinaabe and Cree communities, whose traditional territories encompass the survey area, not as a legal formality, but as genuine intellectual partners whose knowledge is relevant to interpreting the findings. It would require collaboration between geologists, archaeologists, engineers, and indigenous knowledge holders in a sustained project, probably of several years' duration. It would require funding of a scale that typically requires government commitment rather than research council grants. And it would require institutional will to pursue questions whose answers might be complicated for the economic development interests that currently dominate the governance of the Canadian Shield. None of these requirements is insurmountable. What they require is a decision that the question is worth answering, a decision that has not yet been made by the institutions with the capacity to act on it. In the meantime, the passages sit beneath the Canadian Shield, in the darkness of rock that has not seen light since whenever they were last used, surrounded by silver and copper that someone extracted, in quantities large enough to supply continental trade networks, using methods that no official account of the region's history has yet adequately explained. The silver rush that put cobalt on the map in 1903 was not, in the historical sense, a discovery. It was a recognition, by a specific cultural tradition, that measured value in extractable commodities, of something that had already been known and worked by other people for a very long time. The railway workers, who found the first silver float on the shore of Long Lake, were not discovering new territory. They were entering old territory, territory whose mineral wealth had been understood and utilized for millennia, and their tools and institutional frameworks simply could not perceive the traces of that prior utilization. This is not an unusual situation in the history of colonialism. It is, in fact, the characteristic situation. The European encounter with the Americas was not an encounter with empty or unused land. It was an encounter with landscapes that had been inhabited, managed, modified, and understood by sophisticated societies for thousands of years, and the conceptual frameworks that European explorers and settlers brought with them were not adequate to perceive the depth and extent of that prior inhabitation. The Canadian Shield is one of the places where the inadequacy of those frameworks is most visible once you know where to look. The rock is so old, the mineral wealth so profound, and the human history of the region so systematically underdocumented, that the gap between what is known and what remains to be known is larger here than almost anywhere else on the continent. There are researchers who believe that the cobalt embayment passage network, if it proves to be what the preliminary evidence suggests, is not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger pattern of pre-contact underground infrastructure across the Shield. The logic is straightforward. If organized deep extraction occurred at cobalt, it is unlikely to have occurred only at cobalt. The geological conditions that made cobalt attractive also exist at other locations across the Shield. The organizational capacity that deep extraction at cobalt implies was not specific to cobalt, but was a property of the trade networks and cultural systems that the cobalt, copper, and silver fed. This hypothesis is not currently testable without the kind of systematic, regional geophysical survey that has not yet been funded or conducted, but it provides a framework for understanding what the cobalt data might represent in a larger sense. Not an anomaly, but an example. The best documented example of a type of feature that may be widespread across the Shield. If that hypothesis is correct, the implications for the history of pre-contact North America are substantial. They do not overturn the archaeology, which has never claimed that deep extraction was absent, only that it was limited. They do extend it, significantly, in the direction of greater organizational complexity, longer temporal depth, and more extensive geographic reach than the standard accounts have assumed. One of the most striking aspects of the cobalt embayment data is what it implies about timing. The secondary mineral formation dating, if confirmed, places significant extraction activity in the embayment at periods ranging from 500 to 3,000 years before European contact. 3,000 years before European contact in this region means roughly 1,500 BCE, a date that places it squarely in the period of maximum activity of the old copper complex and the early woodland cultural tradition, societies that are well documented in the archaeological literature as having organized copper trade at a continental scale. 500 years before European contact means roughly 1000 CE, a period that is later in the sequence, after the peak of Hopewell, but during the flourishing of what archaeologists call the Mississippian tradition in the American Midwest, a tradition that also shows evidence of extensive copper use and whose trade networks connected it to the Great Lakes region. The idea that large-scale organized extraction was still occurring in the cobalt embayment during this period is not implausible given what is known about the scale and sophistication of Mississippian exchange. What this temporal range suggests is not a brief, isolated episode of deep mining, but a sustained activity across a period of thousands of years, which is exactly what the organizational complexity of the passage network, if it is artificial and connected, would imply. The town of Cobalt today is a small community of roughly 1,200 people, down from its early 20th century peak of many times that number. The mine headframes that once defined its skyline are mostly gone, demolished, or collapsed, and the landscape around the town carries the complicated legacy of a century of industrial extraction, cobalt blue staining of the soil in places where the residual mineral waste has leached, tailings ponds that are slowly being remediated, and the rock cuts and spoil heaps that are the universal signature of hard rock mining. Beneath this landscape, at depths that the industrial mining of the past century may not have fully penetrated, there are features that the modern surveys suggest predate everything that is visible above ground by centuries or millennia. The relationship between what is above and what is below is, in the Cobalt District, not a simple stratigraphic sequence in which more recent activity sits on top of and obscures earlier activity. It is a more complex relationship in which industrial extraction at depth may have intersected with pre-contact passages at depth, creating junctions and obliterations and modifications that complicate interpretation in ways that physical investigation alone could unravel. Several miners who worked in the Cobalt District in the early to mid-20th century, in interviews conducted by local historical societies, describe encountering features during their work underground that they attributed, in the informal language of mining communities, to the old ones or to Indian working. These accounts are consistent across multiple interviewees who did not know each other and whose interviews were conducted decades apart. They describe passages that ran at angles inconsistent with the grid of the industrial operation, that showed no evidence of the tools and materials used in the industrial operation, and that, in some cases, had to be blocked off or blasted through because they created hazards for the industrial workings. None of these accounts appears in the official records of the mining companies. That is not surprising. Official records of mining companies document production, incidents, inspections, and financial matters. They do not routinely document geologically anomalous observations by workers on night shifts. The broader implications of the cobalt embayment research connect to a transformation in archaeological thinking that has been underway, unevenly and incompletely, for several decades. The older models of North American prehistory, derived partly from genuine evidence and partly from assumptions that were never adequately examined, tended to depict pre-contact societies as isolated, technologically limited, organizationally simple, and essentially static across long periods of time. These models were wrong, and the field has known they were wrong for long enough that the knowledge is now established, if not yet fully disseminated. The actual picture, as assembled from several decades of more careful archaeology, genetics, and the belated integration of indigenous oral traditions as legitimate historical evidence, is considerably more dynamic. Pre-contact North America was a continent of complex, interacting societies with trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers, agricultural systems sophisticated enough to support large populations, astronomical knowledge encoded in architecture and landscape, political institutions capable of organizing major collective projects, and intellectual traditions rich enough to have preserved accurate information across many generations without writing. The cobalt embayment passages fit into this picture more naturally than they fit into the older models. They are not an anomaly in a continent of simple societies. They are a piece of evidence about complex societies engaging in complex behavior, which is exactly what complex societies do. There is one more layer to this story that is worth exploring, because it connects the specific evidence from the Canadian Shield to a broader pattern of pre-contact underground infrastructure across the continent that has received scattered but accumulating documentation over the past several decades. The karstic regions of the American Southeast, particularly the Ozark Plateau and the cave systems of Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, and Kentucky show evidence of systematic pre-contact use extending to considerable depth. The crystal-rich formations of caves in these regions were worked for specific materials, and certain cave systems show evidence of human activity at depths and distances from entrances that required deliberate navigation and sustained effort. This is not primitive exploration. This is systematic use of underground space by people who understood it and had reasons for entering it. The copper-bearing regions of the upper Midwest, particularly in Michigan and Wisconsin, show evidence of systematic pre-contact extraction at depths that exceed surface working. The Isle Royale evidence is the best documented, but it is not isolated. Sites in northern Wisconsin and in the Minnesota Arrowhead region have produced extraction evidence that the local geology cannot explain as surface working. The turquoise mines of the American Southwest, worked by pre-contact Puebloan and earlier peoples, show evidence of deep extraction using techniques similar to those documented in the Old World Bronze Age copper mines. Fire setting combined with stone tools and organized debris removal. The turquoise was not a local luxury item. It was an economic commodity traded across hundreds of kilometers as part of the Chacoan exchange network, and the quantities traded required industrial-scale extraction. The pattern across these cases is consistent. Pre-contact North American societies engaged in organized, deep extraction of economically significant minerals at multiple locations across the continent, using technologies that were effective without being European and within organizational frameworks that were sophisticated without being states. The 2021 Restricted Survey, the 2019 Temagami investigation, the archival fragments from the 1908 field report, the oral traditions of the Anishinaabe communities, and the secondary mineral formation dating are all pieces of the same puzzle. Individually, each is suggestive, but not conclusive. Together, they constitute a body of evidence that cannot be explained away without proposing a coincidence of independent errors and misinterpretations so extensive that the coincidence itself would require explanation. The most parsimonious explanation, the one that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions, is that the Canadian Shield was the site of organized, deep, sustained pre-contact mining across a period of several thousand years, that the organizational capacity required for this activity was real and substantial, and that the evidence for it has been available in various forms for as long as European-descended researchers have been working in the region, but has not been assembled into a coherent picture because the institutional frameworks within which that research occurred were not organized to ask the question it would answer. This is not a comfortable conclusion for a history of Canada that begins with European arrival, but it is what the evidence suggests. And the history of the Shield, in its fullness, is the history of the evidence, not the history of the comfortable narrative. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs to underground spaces. It is not the absence of sound in the way that an empty room is silent. It is a presence, a physical property of the enclosed space, the silence of rock that has not vibrated with external sound in however long it has been underground and undisturbed. People who work underground for extended periods describe it as the most complete quiet they have ever experienced, and as something that takes getting used to, because it registers as wrong to nervous systems calibrated for the ambient noise of a surface environment. If you sat in one of the passages of the cobalt embayment, in whatever physical state they are currently in, you would sit in a silence that last heard the sounds of the people who made those passages whenever they were last made. The rock around you would be the same rock that absorbed those sounds. The geometry of the passage, if it is artificial, would reflect the decisions of the people who planned it, decisions made in a cultural context we do not yet understand, for purposes we have not yet determined, using knowledge we have only begun to recover. The scale of what we do not know about the pre-contact history of the Canadian Shield is larger than the scale of what we know. This is a statement about the size of the question, not a statement of despair. Large questions, when pursued with appropriate tools and appropriate humility, have a way of yielding answers that are more interesting than the questions themselves. The graduate researcher who flagged the anomalous radar returns has not published the work that followed that flagging. She is, at last report, completing a doctoral thesis that includes the Temagami data and a methodological framework for investigating pre-contact underground features using non-invasive geophysical methods. The thesis has not yet been submitted. When it is submitted, and when it is published, it will add to the peer-reviewed record a body of work that contributes to the systematic investigation of a question that has been avoided, underfunded, and underprioritized for as long as formal archaeology has been practiced in Northern Ontario. That is a slow process. It is the correct process, the process by which knowledge that has been produced carefully and verified rigorously becomes part of the record that future researchers can build on. But it is a slow process, and the question it addresses has been waiting for serious attention for longer than any of the researchers currently pursuing it have been alive. The passages are not going anywhere. The rock in which they sit is 2.7 billion years old. The passages themselves, if they are what the evidence suggests, are 3,000 years old at most, a blink in geological time, a moment in the history of the shield. They have waited this long. They can wait a little longer. What they cannot do is wait forever in the absence of the investigation that would establish their nature definitively. The mineral exploration industry is not going to wait. The economic pressure on the shield's mineral resources is not going to wait. The passages that have not already been destroyed by industrial mining are at risk of destruction not through any deliberate decision, but through the ordinary operations of an industry that does not know they are there, because the people who might have told them were not asked, and the surveys that might have found them were not conducted. The 2021 Restricted Survey may be the most important geophysical investigation in the history of Canadian archaeology, or it may be one piece in a puzzle that takes another generation to assemble. What it is not, in any interpretation, is irrelevant. The snow comes early to Northern Ontario. By October, the shield is already approaching the colour of deep winter. The green's gone from the forest, the exposed rock grey against a sky that has begun its annual compression toward the horizontal. The lakes go still, and then go glass, and then go white as the ice comes. In the towns along the old mineral belt, the season changes the character of the place. The tourist traffic drops away, the mining-related activity continues but at a different pace, and the winters that the early miners endured in their canvas camps and wood-frame rooming houses become a little more imaginable. Somewhere beneath that winter landscape, in the cold of rock that does not feel seasons, passages sit in their darkness. They do not know they are controversial. They do not know they are the subject of restricted reports and careful academic papers and late-night conversations between researchers who are trying to figure out how to ask the question they need to ask without triggering the institutional responses that would prevent them from answering it. They are simply there, as they have been for whatever time has passed since they were made, waiting for the light. Whether that light will come in the form of systematic archaeological investigation, protected by legal frameworks robust enough to ensure that the investigation serves knowledge rather than extraction, is a question that depends on decisions not yet made by institutions not yet committed to making them. The Canadian Shield holds this secret, and many others, with the patience of very old rock. It has been holding things for 2.7 billion years. A few more decades, a few more surveys, a few more theses submitted and peer-reviewed and added to the record are nothing to the Shield. But they are a great deal to the history that is trying to understand itself. The deepest mystery here is not geological. The geological questions, difficult as they are tractable. Given the right equipment, the right access, the right collaboration, the passages can be found, mapped, sampled, and dated. The geology will, eventually, tell us what it knows. The deeper mystery is historical. If the passages are what the evidence suggests, then the history of the Canadian Shield before European contact is not the simple story of surface-gathering peoples occasionally finding copper in stream beds. It is the history of organized industry, sustained trade, sophisticated knowledge systems, and institutional continuity across periods of time that European history has not attributed to the peoples of this region. That history did not vanish when the diseases arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. It did not vanish when the fur trade restructured the economies of the Shield communities. It did not vanish when the residential schools were imposed and the Indian Act suppressed the cultural transmission through which the history was preserved. It went underground, in a sense, the way the passages went underground, preserved in communities that maintained it at great cost, passed from elders to young people in conditions that were sometimes open and sometimes covert, depending on what the external environment permitted. The oral traditions that describe underground passages in specific geographic areas are not separate from the archaeological evidence. They are part of the same story, preserved in a different medium, by different institutions, with different strengths and vulnerabilities than the stone and charcoal that the archaeologists look for. The convergence of those two streams of knowledge, the geological and the traditional, is what the cobalt embayment research represents at its best moments. Not a conflict between evidence and tradition, but a recognition that the evidence and the tradition are describing the same thing. Canada's oldest mines are not the mines that the 1903 silver rush created. They are the mines that predate the silver rush by thousands of years, that supplied a continental trade network before European contact, and that have been sitting beneath the more recent mines, patient and dark, ever since. The new scans found them. The question now is what we are willing to do with what the scans found, and who we are willing to include in the conversation about what it means. That conversation is overdue. The rock has been waiting long enough. The people whose ancestors made the passages have been waiting longer. The history that the passages represent, the full, complex, deep history of the Canadian Shield, and the peoples who understood it before any European surveyor drew a line across it, deserves the serious attention that the evidence demands. The scans are in, the anomalies are real. The question of what they are, and what they mean, is one of the most important historical questions that Canadian scholarship has not yet fully committed to answering. It is time to go underground. There is a copper knife in the collection of the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, whose provenance card lists it as Upper Great Lakes region, pre-contact, date uncertain. The knife is small, about 12 centimeters long, with a blade that narrows to a point and a handle section that shows evidence of having been fitted with a grip of some organic material, now lost. The copper is not cast, not poured into a mold and allowed to cool, but cold-worked, hammered repeatedly into shape, and annealed between hammering sessions by heating and allowing to cool slowly. The surface shows the characteristic pitting and orange-brown patina of copper that has oxidized over a very long period. The museum's estimate of its age, based on stylistic comparison with similar objects from known contexts, is somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years before present. What the provenance card does not say, because no one thought to ask when the piece was acquired, is where specifically along the Upper Great Lakes the copper came from. By the time most of these objects entered institutional collections, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the collecting context had been lost. The pieces had moved through dealer hands, often multiple times, before reaching the museums. The specific provenance that would tell you exactly which outcrop, which seam, which pit the copper came from, had been erased by the commerce of acquisition. This loss of provenance is not unique to this knife or to this museum. It is characteristic of the vast majority of pre-contact copper objects in institutional collections across North America. The objects survive. The context of their extraction does not. And without the context of extraction, the objects cannot tell you what they would most dearly like to tell you, how they were made, by whom, and from how deep in the earth. The geological complexity of the Canadian Shield is worth understanding in some detail, because it bears on the question of what kind of mining would have been both necessary and possible in different parts of the region. The Shield is not uniform. It is a vast, ancient structure that has been subjected to multiple episodes of deformation, intrusion, erosion, and reburial over its multi-billion-year history, and the result is a mosaic of geological terrains with very different characteristics. The Abitibi Greenstone Belt, which runs roughly east-west through northern Ontario and Quebec, and which includes the Cobalt District and the related gold camps of Timmins and Kirkland Lake, is one of the richest mineral-bearing geological formations in the world. It is also one of the most geologically complex, with multiple generations of volcanic and intrusive rocks interleaved in ways that create a discontinuous but extraordinarily concentrated distribution of mineral deposits. Gold and silver tend to occur in narrow, high-grade veins. Copper and nickel tend to occur in more massive sulfide bodies. The geometry of these deposits is highly variable, ranging from nearly vertical sheets to gently dipping tabular bodies to complex three-dimensional stockworks that require three-dimensional mental models to navigate. Pre-contact miners working in this terrain would have needed to develop those mental models through direct experience, observation, and the accumulation of knowledge across many generations. You cannot learn the three-dimensional geometry of a mineral deposit in a single season. You cannot even learn it in a single generation. The knowledge of where the ore is and how it extends into the earth is the product of long-term, repeated engagement with a specific geological environment. The communities that possess that knowledge in the cobalt embayment and related districts possessed it because they had been working those deposits long enough for the knowledge to accumulate. There is a discipline called ethnogeology that attempts to recover and document the geological knowledge embedded in indigenous oral traditions and cultural practices. It is a young discipline and not a large one, but the work it has produced over the past 3 decades is consistently striking. The geological knowledge encoded in oral traditions turns out, when examined carefully, to be detailed, accurate, and organized in ways that reflect systematic observation over long periods rather than casual acquaintance. The Anishinaabe have geological knowledge encoded in their traditions that encompasses not just the location of specific mineral deposits, but the spatial relationships between different geological formations, the predictive relationships between surface features and subsurface structures, and the seasonal and environmental conditions under which different minerals are most accessible. This knowledge was developed empirically through the same process of observation and testing that underlies scientific geology, but it was organized and transmitted through oral tradition rather than through written texts and formal institutions. When ethnogeologists sit down with Anishinaabe elders and map the geological knowledge embedded in oral traditions against published geological surveys, the correspondence is often striking. Elders describe formations, structures, and mineral occurrences in terms that translate readily into geological language, and the locations they describe correspond with documented geological features. The knowledge is real, it is accurate, and it is old. What this means for the cobalt embayment question is significant. If the traditional knowledge of the communities whose territories include the embayment describes underground passages and their general locations, with an accuracy comparable to the accuracy of the community's other geological knowledge, then that traditional knowledge is evidence of the same quality as the geophysical data, pointing in the same direction. The history of how Canada's mineral wealth was transferred from the communities that knew it to the companies that extracted it is a history that the mining industry has preferred to narrate as a history of discovery. Brave prospectors, difficult terrain, fortuitous accidents, the triumph of determination over adversity. This narrative is not entirely false. There were brave prospectors. The terrain was genuinely difficult. Fortuitous accidents did occur. But the narrative omits the prior condition that made all of this possible. There was someone to learn from. The guides who accompanied the early prospectors into the Canadian Shield were, in many cases, members of the communities whose ancestors had worked the mineral deposits that the prospectors were hoping to find. The knowledge of the landscape that those guides carried, the knowledge of which streams drained, which mineral formations, which surface stains indicated which subsurface deposits, which terrain features correlated with which geological structures, was not generic woodsmanship. It was specific, mineral-focused knowledge that had been accumulated by communities engaged in extraction over very long periods. This knowledge transfer is documented in some of the historical accounts, where it is typically described in patronizing terms that attribute the prospector's success to their own skill and resourcefulness, while characterizing the knowledge of the guides as instinctive or primitive. Reading those accounts with the benefit of subsequent archaeological and ethnogeological research, it is possible to see what is actually being described. The systematic transfer of mining knowledge from the communities that developed it over thousands of years to the industry that would exploit it at industrial scale. The International Nickel Company, which became Inco and is now part of Vale, began operations in the Sudbury Basin in the 1880s and quickly grew into one of the most profitable mining companies in the world. By the early 20th century, Inco was extracting hundreds of thousands of tons of nickel-copper ore per year from a network of mines that penetrated hundreds of meters into the earth. The scale of the operation was unprecedented in Canadian history. The wealth it generated was staggering, flowing primarily to shareholders in New York and London, while the communities whose territories had been incorporated into the mining district received little of direct benefit and bore most of the environmental cost. Inco's early operations encountered, in the mines, occasional features that did not fit the expected geological record. Some of these features were logged by mine captains and foremen and eventually found their way into the company's geological files. Others were simply blasted through because efficiency did not admit of curiosity. The geological files, which are held in part by Vale's archives and in part by the Ontario Geological Survey, have not been comprehensively searched for references to pre-contact features. No one has been funded to do that search. There are people who think the search would be rewarding. They have been making this argument in various forms for a long time, without generating the institutional support that would allow them to actually conduct it. The relationship between deep time and human time is one of the organizing puzzles of the Canadian Shield. When you work with rock that formed 2.7 billion years ago, your sense of human history compresses to a point of almost comical insignificance. The entire span of documented human history, from the first written records to the present, occupies less than 0.1% of the age of the Shield. The pre-contact history of the Shield, extending back perhaps 20,000 years to the first human arrival in the region after the retreat of the last glaciation, occupies less than 0.001% of the Shield's age. And yet within that tiny fraction of geological time, enormous things happened. The landscape was entirely reshaped, not once, but several times. The boreal forest that now covers the Shield established itself from scratch after the ice retreated. The lake system that gives the region its character formed, evolved, and in some cases dramatically changed course as glacial lakes drained and isostatic rebound lifted the land. The animal communities changed, with the megafauna of the late Pleistocene giving way to the modern fauna, and human communities arrived, adapted, developed complex cultural systems, built trade networks, organized industries, and left traces in the rock that are only now beginning to be systematically examined. The passages of the cobalt embayment, if they are what the evidence suggests, represent a moment in that compressed human history when the people of the Shield understood something about the earth beneath their feet that they converted into organized economic activity at a scale we have only begun to appreciate. Academic archaeology in Canada has been grappling, slowly and with considerable internal resistance, with the implications of two developments that have transformed the field in the past 2 decades. The first is the growing body of archaeological, genetic, and paleoclimatic evidence that substantially revises older accounts of pre-contact North America in the direction of greater complexity, longer temporal depth, and more sophisticated organization. The second is the legal and ethical transformation of the researcher-community relationship, driven by Indigenous rights frameworks and by the growing assertion by Indigenous communities of their role as intellectual partners in, rather than merely subjects of, research about their histories. These two developments are not independent. The Indigenous communities, whose knowledge is being recognized as a legitimate research resource, are also the communities whose histories are being revised toward greater complexity. The recognition of the knowledge and the revision of the history are part of the same process, a process that is uncomfortable for scholars trained in an older tradition but that is producing better history. In the specific context of pre-contact shield mining, this means that the questions being asked are changing. The older question was whether significant pre-contact mining occurred. That question has been answered, affirmatively, in the peer-reviewed literature. The newer questions are, how extensive was it? How organized was it? How deep did it go? And what were the cultural and organizational systems that made it possible? These are harder questions, requiring more sophisticated methods and more inclusive research partnerships, but they are the right questions. The geophysicist who led the 2021 restricted survey has described, in the recorded conversation mentioned earlier, the experience of working through the data in the weeks after the fieldwork. The experience he describes is not that of a scientist confirming a hypothesis, but of a scientist being led somewhere by data that was doing something he had not expected it to do. The radar returns from the cobalt embayment anomalies were, in his description, distinctively different from the returns he was used to seeing in mineral exploration surveys. The mineral targets he was looking for produced returns with specific characteristics, broad, diffuse anomalies that reflected the physical properties of the target minerals. What he was seeing in the anomalous returns was something sharper, more geometrically regular, reflecting structures with boundaries rather than masses with gradients. The experience of recognizing that you are looking at something your professional training has not prepared you for is, he says, unusual in mineral exploration geophysics, where the targets are generally well characterized and the anomalies generally fit known categories. It is the experience of the edges of knowledge, the point where your categories stop being adequate, and you have to decide whether to force the data into the inadequate categories or acknowledge that you are looking at something new. He decided to acknowledge it. That decision is why the report exists, why it was distributed, and why the conversation about the cobalt embayment is happening at all. The question of access to the passages, assuming they are eventually confirmed as artificial, is not simple. The cobalt embayment sits within a complex web of land tenure, mineral tenure, indigenous rights, and environmental regulation that would make physical investigation a legally intricate undertaking even if the institutional will to conduct it existed. The surface lands are a mixture of private property, crown land, and lands subject to treaty provisions whose interpretation has been contested in the courts for decades. The mineral rights, separately from the surface rights in the Canadian system, are held by a combination of the Ontario government, private companies, and in some cases, individuals. The areas where the passages appear to be located include active mineral exploration tenements, which means the companies holding those tenements have existing rights that would affect any investigation of the subsurface. Coordinating physical investigation in this environment would require a level of intergovernmental and interinstitutional cooperation that Canadian archaeology has rarely achieved, particularly in circumstances where the economic stakes of the underlying mineral rights are significant. This is not an impossible challenge. It has been met in other jurisdictions for similarly complex situations. But it requires political will of a kind that is not currently visible. The most optimistic scenario for physical investigation involves a collaborative research program established by treaty agreement between the provincial government, the federal government, the relevant Indigenous nations, and the academic institutions with relevant expertise. Such a program would require sustained funding at a level above typical Research Council grants, and it would require legal frameworks that protected the archaeological investigation from interference by the economic interests in the underlying mineral rights. None of these requirements is in place. All of them are theoretically achievable within the existing Canadian legal and institutional framework. The winters of Northern Ontario have a quality that shapes everything about life in the region. The cold is not merely a temperature. It is a physical presence, a mass of air that settles into the landscape and transforms it, silencing sounds, freezing surfaces, compressing activity into the shorter days and longer nights. The lakes, which are the dominant geographical feature of the Shield, shift from impediment to highway when they freeze, and the ice roads that open across them in the deep cold are, for communities that depend on them, as important as any asphalt highway. The pre-contact communities of the Shield understood winter in ways that modern Canadians, most of whom live in cities insulated from the extreme cold, do not. Winter was not an interruption of economic activity. It was a season with its own economic logic, its own transportation advantages, and its own demands on knowledge and preparation. The ice that made lakes into highways also made them into workplaces, offering access to fish through the ice that summer's open water complicated. The cold that froze the landscape also preserved certain organic materials, and the Shield communities developed technologies for exploiting the frozen landscape with a sophistication that we have only recently begun to document. Underground spaces, in this context, had a particular value. The temperature below the frost line in the rock of the Shield remains roughly constant through the year, hovering around 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, regardless of the extremes above. This is significantly warmer than winter surface temperatures and significantly cooler than summer surface temperatures. It is the temperature of a natural refrigerator. The communities that had access to underground spaces had access to a year-round controlled temperature environment that could serve functions ranging from food storage to processing of materials that required consistent temperatures to the conduct of activities that the weather above made impossible for months at a time. This thermal property of underground spaces is not speculative. It is physics, and it applies to the passages of the cobalt embayment as fully as to any other underground space. If those passages were used by pre-contact communities, they would have been used in part for reasons that have nothing to do with mineral extraction, reasons rooted in the very practical advantages of a constant, moderate temperature in a landscape of extreme thermal variation. The question of what happened to the communities that possessed deep knowledge of the shield's underground resources when European contact disrupted those communities is one of the most painful aspects of the larger story. The disruption was not gradual, it was catastrophic in the literal sense of a catastrophic event, a sudden, devastating change in conditions that destroyed an enormous portion of the human capital of the affected societies. The epidemics of the 16th and 17th centuries, moving ahead of European settlers into territories that had not yet experienced direct contact, killed a substantial portion of the indigenous population of North America. The estimates of pre-contact population vary widely, but all serious estimates agree that the mortality from the epidemic waves was enormous, in some regions exceeding 90% of the population over the course of a few generations. The knowledge that was lost in those deaths was not recorded anywhere. The elders who knew the mining traditions, the specialists who understood the geological knowledge, the cultural practitioners who encoded that knowledge in ritual and narrative, they died, and the transmission chains that carried their knowledge broke. This is not the end of the story. Communities that survived the epidemics, and many did survive, also survived with fragments of the knowledge, reduced by mortality, stressed by the social disruption that epidemic mortality causes, but not completely extinguished. What exists today in the oral traditions of the Anishinaabe and related communities is the survivor, the portion of the pre-epidemic knowledge base that made it through 3 centuries of epidemic, displacement, colonial restriction, and cultural suppression. It is less than what existed before, but it is real, and it is evidence. The geochemistry of pre-contact copper objects offers a potential avenue for answering the provenance question that the loss of collection context has made so difficult. Different copper deposits have slightly different trace element profiles, signatures in the ratios of minor elements that are characteristic of the specific geological formation from which the copper came. Lead isotope ratios, which vary between deposits formed at different times and in different geological environments, are particularly useful for source tracing. The application of this technique to pre-contact copper objects, correlating the trace element profiles of objects in institutional collections with the profiles of known deposits in the Canadian Shield, is technically feasible and has been attempted at small scale with promising results. A systematic program of this kind, sampling objects from major collections and correlating them with comprehensive geological sampling of Shield copper deposits, would not answer the question of extraction depth directly, but would answer the prior question of which deposits were being exploited and how extensively, which would in turn constrain the question of what kind of extraction was required. Such a program would be expensive but not prohibitively so, and it would produce results that would significantly advance understanding of the pre-contact copper trade. No comprehensive program of this kind has yet been funded. The individual studies that have been conducted are suggestive but not conclusive, and they have been conducted with sample sizes too small to support strong conclusions. There is a particular kind of investigator who is drawn to the cobalt embayment question, and it is worth describing the type. This investigator tends to have technical training in a field outside of traditional archaeology, often geology or engineering or geophysics, combined with an interest in the history of the region that led them, by routes they did not anticipate, into contact with the pre-contact evidence. They did not set out to find evidence of pre-contact deep mining. They found it while doing something else. This pattern of accidental discovery is significant. The evidence is not concentrated in places where archaeologists looking for it would look. It is distributed across the geological surveys, the archival collections, the mineral exploration records, and the oral traditions of the affected communities. It shows up when people whose professional attention is focused on something else look carefully at what is in front of them and find that it does not fit the categories they were trained to apply. The next major discovery in this story will almost certainly follow the same pattern. Someone doing something else will encounter data that does not fit, and they will face the choice of forcing it into inadequate categories or acknowledging that they are looking at something new. The outcome of that choice, repeated across many investigators in many contexts, will determine the pace at which the full history of the Canadian Shield is recovered. The administrative archives of the Cobalt Mining Division, held at the Ontario Archives in Toronto, contain hundreds of linear feet of records from the period 1905 to 1950, covering every aspect of the administrative regulation of the silver mining industry in the district. These records include inspection reports, accident investigations, mine maps, ventilation surveys, and a category of document labeled miscellaneous correspondence that contains, among many other things, communications between mine officials and the government that do not fit neatly into any of the other administrative categories. A researcher working through this miscellaneous correspondence in the early 2000s, looking for material on the occupational health history of the cobalt miners, encountered several letters that described underground features the letter writers found puzzling. The letters were written by mine managers or engineers to the district mining inspector, apparently in response to a requirement to report unusual conditions underground. The features described were passages that appeared to be older than the industrial operations, and the writers, all of them practical mining men without any particular interest in archaeology or pre-contact history, were seeking guidance on how to treat the passages, whether to record them formally, whether to report them to any authority other than the mining inspector, and whether there were any legal implications of their existence. The inspector's responses, where they survive, do not address the substance of the question. They note that the passages have been reported and advise that mining operations may continue as planned. The archaeological significance of the features is not mentioned because it was not, in 1910 or 1912 or 1917, a category that the administrative framework recognized. What the mine managers of the early 20th century did not know, and what the researchers of the early 21st century are only beginning to piece together, is that the passages they were encountering were not isolated curiosities. They were the exposed ends of a system whose extent they had no way to assess, because the system lay below the horizons their operations had yet to reach, and beside the workings their operations had not yet planned. The industrial mines of the cobalt district went deep, but not uniformly deep. The silver veins were rich near the surface and became less economically attractive at depth, so the deepest workings were driven by the highest grade portions of the ore body, and the surrounding rock was often left unexplored. The passages of the pre-contact network, if the geophysical data is correct, occupy a range of depths that in some areas lies between the industrially exploited near-surface zones and the depths that were considered uneconomic to explore. They were, in a sense, hidden in the gap between what the early 20th century industry could profitably exploit and what it could afford to ignore. The ground-penetrating radar of the 2021 survey penetrated to depths greater than the industrial operations at several of the survey locations, and it is at those greater depths that the most coherent portion of the passage network appears to lie. The industrial operations that encountered passages were encountering the shallowest portions of a system that extends deeper than early industrial technology found economic to follow. There are researchers in the field who resist the tunnel network interpretation of the geophysical data, and their objections deserve to be taken seriously. The most substantive objection is technical. Ground-penetrating radar, at the depths involved in the 2021 survey, has limitations in resolution and in the ability to distinguish between different types of subsurface features. Voids in rock, whether natural or artificial, produce similar signatures. The geometric interpretation that the survey team has put on the data requires assumptions about the nature of the features that the data alone cannot fully support. This is a valid point, and it is exactly the point that makes physical investigation necessary. The geophysical data is suggestive, not conclusive. The interpretation of the data as a connected artificial passage network is the most parsimonious interpretation of the geometric characteristics of the anomalies, but it is not the only possible interpretation. What would make it conclusive is direct physical access. The ability to enter the passages, sample the walls, retrieve dating material, and confirm or refute the interpretation by direct observation. The objection to the tunnel network interpretation, at this stage of the investigation, is not a reason to abandon the interpretation, but a reason to design the physical investigation that would test it rigorously. The researchers who find the interpretation convincing and the researchers who find it unconvincing agree on one thing. The question needs to be answered by going underground. The funding landscape for this kind of research in Canada is complicated. The major federal research funding agencies, particularly the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, do fund archaeological research, but the funding levels available through these agencies are modest compared to the scale of the interdisciplinary, multi-year, multi-institutional program that the cobalt embayment question requires. The major private foundations that fund archaeological research in Canada have focused primarily on specific site investigations rather than large-scale regional programs. The provincial government of Ontario has programs that support heritage research, but has not historically funded mining archaeology at the scale needed. The most plausible route to adequate funding involves a combination of sources: federal heritage funding, provincial heritage funding, Indigenous-controlled funding from the settlement of resource-related claims, and possibly a public engagement component that draws on the demonstrated public interest in pre-contact North American history. None of these sources is individually adequate. Combination of them, organized around a research program with clear objectives and a credible track record, might be. The institutional framework for such a program does not yet exist, but it is being discussed, quietly, by researchers who understand both the significance of the question and the political complexity of the environment in which the answer would have to be pursued. The communities most directly affected by this research, the First Nations whose traditional territories encompass the cobalt embayment and related areas, are not passive observers of the process. They are active participants with their own interests, their own knowledge, and their own institutions for making decisions about how that knowledge is shared and protected. Some communities have been engaged with the geophysical research in formal consultation processes. Others have been aware of the research through less formal channels and have chosen, at least for now, to observe rather than participate. A small number of communities have been actively collaborating with researchers, sharing traditional knowledge in controlled settings, and contributing to the interpretation of the geophysical data in ways that have shaped the direction of the investigation. The relationship between Indigenous communities and researchers in this field has improved significantly in recent years, driven by legal change, by the demonstrated value of traditional knowledge in archaeological interpretation, and by the personal relationships that individual researchers have built with community members over years of respectful engagement. It remains, however, imperfect, and the history of exploitation and misappropriation that underlies the relationship is present in every conversation. Trust is built slowly in this context, and it can be destroyed quickly. The researchers who have made the most progress are the ones who have understood that the relationship is not a means to an end, but a part of the work itself. There is a geological feature of the Canadian Shield that is relevant to the passage network question, and that has not received the attention it deserves in discussions of pre-contact mining. The Shield is cut by thousands of fault zones and fracture systems, many of which are ancient and which have been reactivated multiple times during the Shield's long geological history. These fracture systems create pathways of weakness in otherwise massive rock, and they have two important properties for the question of pre-contact mining. First, fracture zones in ore-bearing rock tend to concentrate mineralization because fluids carrying dissolved metals preferentially move through zones of higher permeability. The silver veins of the Cobalt District and the copper deposits of the broader Shield are both associated with specific fracture systems, and the geometry of those fracture systems determines the geometry of the ore bodies in ways that an experienced miner would quickly learn to read. Second, fracture zones create natural pathways that can be exploited for underground movement because the rock along a fracture is often weaker and more easily worked than the massive rock on either side. A mining operation that followed fracture systems would naturally produce passages that followed those systems, with orientations and geometries determined by the geological structure rather than by arbitrary choice. This means that a connected pre-contact mining network would not necessarily follow straight lines or right-angle grids. It would follow the geological grain of the ore bodies, which is exactly what the geometric characteristics of the cobalt embayment anomalies appear to show. This geological logic provides a framework for thinking about how the passages were planned that does not require the pre-contact miners to have had abstract surveying technology. They would have needed to understand the geological structure of the ore bodies, which they did, based on the evidence of the trade quantities that their operations supported. Following the geological grain of the fractures would have produced a connected network as a natural consequence of following the ore. The metallurgical analysis of pre-contact copper objects has, over the past 2 decades, produced results that bear directly on the question of the organizational scale of shield mining. Copper that has been cold-worked and annealed multiple times, as the best pre-contact copper objects were, has a microstructural signature that distinguishes it from copper that has been worked only once or a few times. The microstructure also reflects the temperature history of the annealing process, with different annealing temperatures producing different grain structures. Analysis of these microstructures in museum collections has revealed that the best pre-contact copper objects, the ones associated with high-status burials and long-distance trade, show evidence of sophisticated and controlled metalworking, repeated cycles of hammering and carefully controlled annealing that required understanding of the material properties of copper and of the relationship between temperature, time, and microstructural change. This is not accidental or intuitively obvious knowledge. It is the product of sustained experimentation and careful observation, organized and transmitted across multiple generations. The organizational requirements for this kind of sophisticated metalworking are comparable to the organizational requirements for systematic deep mining. Both require specialized knowledge accumulated over long periods, institutional structures for transmitting that knowledge, and coordination between the specialists who possess the knowledge and the broader communities whose economic activities the knowledge serves. The relationship between the surface trade networks and the underground extraction that supplied them is a question that has received almost no attention in the scholarly literature. The Hopewell trade network is well documented in its surface expression. The movement of raw materials and finished goods across hundreds of kilometers, the concentration of imported materials in high-status burials, the social mechanisms of exchange that connected communities across vast distances. But the literature treats the supply side of this trade almost as if the materials arrived from nowhere. Where did the copper come from? From the shield, primarily. From specific deposits that the archaeology has not yet fully characterized. How did it get there? Through trade, obviously, but from how far underground, extracted by how many people, organized by what institutions? These are the questions that the cobalt embayment data begins to address, and they are questions whose answers would fundamentally change the picture of what the Hopewell trade network was. If the copper that moved through the Hopewell network came from organized deep mining rather than from surface collection, the scale of the productive enterprise that supported the network was larger than current estimates assume. Larger productive capacity implies more people engaged in extraction, more elaborate organization of that extraction, more complex supply chains, and more institutional continuity across the generations needed to develop and maintain the extraction operations. This does not overturn the existing archaeology of the Hopewell network. It extends it, backward and downward, into the underground. The legacy of lead contamination in the Cobalt District complicates modern archaeological investigation in a way that deserves mention. The industrial silver mining of the early 20th century produced enormous quantities of mine tailings, the waste rock and processed material that remained after the silver was extracted. These tailings, spread across the landscape around Cobalt and discharged into the local waterways, contain elevated levels of lead, arsenic, cobalt, and other metals that are toxic at elevated concentrations. The contamination is well documented and is the subject of ongoing environmental remediation efforts. It is also, from an archaeological perspective, a layer of chemical noise that complicates the interpretation of soil chemistry data in the Cobalt District. Any attempt to use soil geochemistry to track pre-contact extraction activity runs into the problem of distinguishing the pre-contact signal from the industrial contamination that overlies it. Ground-penetrating radar is not affected by soil chemistry, which is one reason the geophysical approach has been productive in this district, where conventional archaeological methods face particular challenges. But combining geophysical data with chemical data, which would strengthen the interpretation significantly, requires methods capable of distinguishing the pre-contact and industrial signals in the contaminated soils, and those methods are not yet well developed for this specific context. The contamination is, in this sense, a legacy of industrial exploitation that complicates not just the present ecology of the district, but the future archaeology of its pre-contact history. The industrial era left behind not just tailings, but a chemical veil that makes reading the landscape beneath the industry more difficult than it would otherwise be. The international context of the cobalt embayment research is worth considering, because the question of pre-contact deep mining is not unique to Canada. Similar questions are being asked, with varying degrees of institutional support and public attention, at sites in Bolivia, in Peru, in West Africa, in Southern Africa, and in several parts of Southeast Asia. The Old World sites, particularly those in Europe and the Near East, are better documented because European archaeology has been investigating pre-industrial mining for longer and with more resources than has been available for equivalent research in North America or Africa. But the accumulation of evidence from the non-European sites is changing the picture. The Bomgeza shipwreck off the coast of Namibia, dated to the early 16th century, contained large quantities of copper from sources that have since been matched by trace element analysis to specific pre-contact mining sites in sub-Saharan Africa. The match confirms that organized copper production at significant scale was occurring in parts of Africa before European contact, at depths and on schedules that required organizational frameworks comparable to those of contemporary European mining. The African evidence is not yet as detailed as the European evidence, but it is consistent with it and it is growing. The Canadian evidence fits into this global pattern. Pre-contact mining at depth, organized at scales, requiring sophisticated institutional structures, appears to have occurred wherever mineral resources were sufficiently concentrated and accessible to make the investment of organizational capacity worthwhile. The specific form it took, the technologies used, the organizational institutions involved, the trade networks that received the products, all varied by context. But the basic phenomenon of organized pre-industrial deep extraction appears to be more widespread than the older archaeology assumed. The people of the cobalt embayment, the communities whose ancestors extracted silver and copper from the shield for thousands of years, did not record their activities in forms that European-trained researchers initially recognized as records. They recorded them in oral traditions, in the physical features of the landscape they managed, in the distribution patterns of the materials they traded, and in the geological modifications of the ore bodies they worked. These records are real. They are durable, in the case of the geological modifications, extraordinarily durable. They are interpretable, with the right tools and the right partnerships, and they are beginning to be interpreted. The history they record is not a history of simple people in a simple landscape, subsisting on what the land offered and leaving no deeper mark. It is a history of organized industry, sustained over millennia, supplying trade networks that connected the continent, and leaving traces in the earth that geophysical technology is only now capable of reading. That history has been available to be read for as long as researchers have been willing to look. The tools to read it have improved dramatically. The institutional will to pursue the reading is, slowly and incompletely, developing. The partnerships that make the reading legitimate are being built, imperfectly and with difficulty, between communities that have been on opposite sides of the colonial divide for centuries. The result, when it comes, will be a revision of the history of North America that is not dramatic in the way that popular history expects its revisions to be dramatic. There will be no single discovery, no single document, no single passage entered with a camera that transforms everything in a moment. There will be accumulation, the slow, careful assembly of evidence from multiple directions into a picture that, once assembled, becomes impossible to see around. The graduate researcher who flagged the anomalous returns and has been working toward her doctoral thesis is not alone. There is a small but growing cohort of younger researchers, mostly in their 30s and early 40s, who are approaching the pre-contact history of the Canadian Shield with better tools, better frameworks, and better partnerships than were available to previous generations. They are not all working on the same question, but their work is converging on a set of conclusions that, taken together, substantially revise the older account. These researchers communicate with each other through the informal channels of academia, conferences, shared preprints, email threads that develop into collaborations. They are building, collectively, an understanding of the Shield's pre-contact history that will eventually need institutional support to develop fully, but that is already sophisticated enough to anchor serious investigation. Some of them will succeed in getting that support. Some of them will find their careers diverted by the practical pressures of academic life in an era of constrained funding and competitive hiring. Some of them will make the discoveries that change the picture, and some of them will make the incremental contributions that enable those discoveries without getting the credit that the enabling deserves. This is how knowledge advances in difficult fields, and the pre-contact history of the Canadian Shield is a difficult field in every relevant sense. The night sky over northern Ontario is, in the absence of cloud and away from the lights of towns, genuinely dark in a way that few Canadians experience. The Shield's low population density means that light pollution, which has eliminated the night sky for most urban populations, is absent or minimal over vast stretches of the region. On a clear winter night, the stars are thick enough to be confused for each other, and the Milky Way is a physical presence in the sky rather than a concept. The pre-contact communities of the Shield had that sky every clear night. They observed it with the attention that people give to something that matters, because the sky mattered, as a calendar, as a navigation system, as a source of cosmological meaning, as a subject of the kind of sustained observation that produces, over generations, detailed and accurate knowledge. The astronomical knowledge encoded in Anishinaabe tradition is, by the accounts of researchers who have examined it carefully, both detailed and accurate, reflecting generations of systematic observation organized and transmitted through cultural institutions. The same communities that observed the night sky with this attention also observed the landscape beneath their feet with the same attention. The geological knowledge and the astronomical knowledge are products of the same cultural orientation, the same institutional structures for accumulating and transmitting empirical knowledge, the same commitment to understanding the environment with sufficient accuracy to act effectively within it. The evidence of the sky observations has been well documented by ethnoastronomers. The evidence of the geological observations, encoded in the same traditions and now being correlated with the geophysical data of the Shield, is the subject of the investigation that this script has been tracing. The cobalt-silver rush of 1903 is, in Canadian popular history, a story of discovery, prosperity, and the opening of the North. It is taught in Ontario schools as an instance of the human capacity to find and exploit natural wealth, to transform wilderness into industry, to build communities from nothing in difficult terrain. This is not an entirely false story. The people who came to cobalt in those years were doing something genuinely difficult, and many of them suffered genuinely in the dangerous conditions of early industrial hard rock mining for the prosperity that the district generated. But the story of discovery is the wrong story. What happened in 1903 was not discovery. It was recognition by a specific cultural and economic system of wealth that other people had recognized and worked for thousands of years before the railway arrived. The landscape was not empty when the prospectors came. It was old, used, understood, and alive with a history that the prospectors did not have the tools to read. The passages of the cobalt embayment are part of that history. They are not a footnote to the story of the Silver Rush. They are the preface to it, a preface that is longer, deeper, and more complex than the main text that followed it. Reading that preface, properly and completely, requires the kind of sustained, collaborative, well-resourced investigation that has not yet been undertaken, but that the evidence demands. The final piece of this story, for now, is not a discovery. It is a process, ongoing and incomplete, driven by researchers who are motivated by the question more than by the prospects of institutional recognition, and by communities whose relationship to the history is more personal than academic. The process is producing evidence. The evidence is accumulating. The picture it is assembling is becoming clearer. What is becoming clear is this. Beneath Canada's oldest recorded mines, there are older mines, not as a metaphor, not as a suggestion, not as a theory that requires a revolution in understanding to accept, but as a physical fact, waiting for the investigation that will confirm and characterize it. The passages are there. The evidence that they are there is real. The communities whose ancestors made them know that they are there, in the sense that knowledge of deep and specific things can persist across the catastrophe of colonial history if the carriers of that knowledge are determined enough to carry it. The scans found a tunnel network beneath Canada's oldest mines. The tunnel network is older than the mines. The mines are older than anyone's recorded history of the region. And the people who made the passages understood something about the Earth that the geophysicists of the 21st century are only now, with the most sophisticated tools available, beginning to confirm. That is the story. It is not finished, but it is real. To understand the passage network in its full context, you have to understand what the word mine meant before it became an industrial term. For most of human history, the extraction of materials from the earth did not have a word that separated it from other forms of engagement with the landscape. You gathered plants, you hunted animals, you found and worked stone, you found and worked metal. These were all parts of the same continuous relationship with a landscape that provided everything needed for life, and they were all organized by the same institutions, the same systems of knowledge transmission, the same cultural frameworks that governed every other aspect of community life. The specialization that we associate with mining, the dedicated organization of labor and knowledge around the systematic extraction of specific materials from specific locations, did not arise fully formed. It developed gradually as the economic significance of specific materials grew large enough to justify the investment of organizational capacity that specialized extraction required. In the Great Lakes region, copper was the material that first reached this threshold. The quantities of copper in the trade networks, the skill of the metalworking, the geographic range of the distribution, all indicate that copper production had, by roughly 3,000 years ago, developed into a specialized industry rather than a casual supplement to foraging and horticulture. This specialization created communities of practice, groups of people whose primary economic identity was organized around extraction, whose knowledge was deep and specific, whose social position within the broader network of exchange communities was defined by their role in producing something that everyone wanted and that only they could produce at scale. These were miners, in the fullest sense, without the word and without the industrial technology, but with the organizational identity and the specialized knowledge that the word implies. The transformation of the shield landscape over the past 5,000 years is a story that geology and archaeology can tell in complementary terms. The geological record shows the slow rebound of the land from the weight of glacial ice, a process still continuing today that raises the shield at rates of up to a centimetre per year in some areas. This isostatic rebound changed the drainage patterns of the landscape, creating new waterways and drowning old ones, reshaping the shorelines of the shield lakes, and gradually exposing rock surfaces that had been submerged since the ice retreated. The archaeological record shows human communities adapting to this changing landscape, shifting their settlement patterns, their subsistence strategies, and their material culture in response to environmental change. The communities that developed deep copper extraction in the shield were doing so in a landscape that was itself still changing, adapting their knowledge of the geological structure of the ore bodies to a surface geography that was, on the scale of human generations, significantly different from what it had been a few generations earlier. This dynamic context makes the long-term persistence of extractive knowledge more impressive, not less. The knowledge of where the copper and silver were and how to get them was not static knowledge of a fixed landscape. It was dynamic knowledge that had to adapt as the landscape changed, as water levels shifted, as surface outcroppings were exposed or buried by changing erosion patterns. The communities that maintained this knowledge across multiple generations of landscape change were demonstrating cognitive and cultural capacities of a high order. The specific geology of the cobalt-silver deposit offers another angle on the pre-contact extraction question. The silver at Cobalt is extraordinary in several respects. First, it occurs in native form, as metallic silver rather than as a silver-bearing mineral compound. Native silver requires no smelting or chemical processing to use. You extract it from the rock, clean the rock matrix off it, and you have a metalworking material. This is the same quality that made the Lake Superior native copper so significant. It was immediately usable by communities that lacked smelting technology. Second, the silver at Cobalt occurs in veins of unusual richness and accessibility. The concentrations are high enough that relatively small volumes of rock could yield significant quantities of metal. This means that even low-efficiency extraction methods could produce economically significant quantities of silver, as long as the location of the veins was known and the rock could be accessed. Third, the specific gravity of native silver is much higher than the surrounding rock. Silver is dense, and when the veins erode at the surface, the silver tends to concentrate in stream sediments and in crevices in bedrock. A community following stream beds and bedrock surfaces in the cobalt area would encounter native silver without difficulty, and the concentration of the outcroppings would quickly suggest the location of the subsurface veins from which they derived. Pre-contact use of cobalt silver is therefore not surprising. What is surprising, or rather what would be surprising if the evidence were not accumulating to suggest it, is the extent of the pre-contact extraction. Native silver at depth, below the zone of surface oxidation, where native metal forms, requires extraction of the vein rock and processing of the silver-bearing minerals, a more complex operation than surface collection. The evidence of organized passages at depth in the cobalt district points toward extraction of this more complex kind. The connection between the cobalt passages and the copper-bearing zones further west along the shield is not merely geographic. The trade networks that moved shield copper across the continent also moved shield silver, as is demonstrated by the presence of silver objects in Hopewell burial contexts, far outside the range of any known surface deposit. The cobalt silver, specifically, has the geological characteristics to produce the trace element profile that distinguishes it from other silver sources, and a systematic program of trace element analysis on Hopewell silver objects would determine whether cobalt silver appears in that context. No such systematic program has been conducted. The relevant collections are spread across dozens of museums and universities. The analytical work required is expensive, and no institution has taken on the coordination role that such a program would require. But the question is answerable in principle, and the answer would bear directly on the extent and significance of the pre-contact cobalt operation. The argument for taking the passage network hypothesis seriously, against the default skepticism that novelty always faces in established fields, can be made on several independent grounds. First, the geological evidence for artificial void spaces in the cobalt embayment from two independent survey methods is consistent with the hypothesis and inconsistent with the most plausible natural alternatives. Second, the archival evidence for encounters with pre-contact features during early industrial mining, while fragmentary and non-systematic, is consistent across multiple sources and time periods. Third, the oral tradition evidence from Anishinaabe communities, where it has been correlated with geological features, has demonstrated predictive accuracy that warrants treating it as evidence rather than as narrative. Fourth, the secondary mineral formation dating, while preliminary and not yet peer-reviewed, is consistent with the hypothesis and inconsistent with a null hypothesis of no significant pre-contact extraction. Fifth, the archaeological context of the old copper complex and related traditions provides a framework within which organized deep extraction is not implausible but is, in fact, expected given the demonstrated scale of the copper trade. Each of these lines of evidence, individually, is consistent with interpretations other than the passage network hypothesis. Together, they form a convergent case that is significantly stronger than any individual component. The convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence on a consistent conclusion is exactly the evidentiary standard that serious archaeological interpretation requires. The challenge of communicating this story to a public audience is partly a challenge of scale. The geological timescales, the human generational timescales, the institutional timescales of research and publication all operate at rhythms that resist the narrative compression that popular communication requires. The story of the cobalt embayment passages does not have a single dramatic moment. It has accumulation, convergence, the slow assembly of evidence from multiple directions. This is less satisfying, in the narrative sense, than a single discovery. But it is more convincing, in the epistemic sense, because it reflects the actual process by which important historical conclusions are established. The popular accounts of pre-contact North America that have achieved wide circulation, whether in academic form or in popular media, have tended to favor either the dramatic discovery narrative, in which a single site or artifact changes everything, or the progressive revelation narrative, in which each new archaeological finding slightly updates the picture. Both of these narrative forms underrepresent the significance of convergent evidence from multiple independent sources, which is often the most compelling form of historical argument. The cobalt embayment story is a convergent evidence story. The geophysical data, the archival fragments, the traditional knowledge, the secondary mineralogy, the archaeological context all point in the same direction. The cumulative weight of this convergence is substantial, but it does not fit neatly into either of the standard popular narratives, which is one reason it has not yet received the public attention that its evidentiary significance warrants. In the early days of the cobalt-silver rush, when the first prospectors were following the railway cut and finding silver float in the exposed rock, there were Anishinaabe community members watching. Some of them were employed as laborers by the early mining operations, doing surface work while the engineers and miners took the underground jobs that the companies preferred to fill with European workers. Some of them were watching from a distance, aware of what was being disturbed by the new excavations, aware of what the rock that was being blasted and hauled away contained beyond the silver that the newcomers were after. We do not have detailed records of what these observers thought or said, because the records that were kept by the mining companies and the government, institutions that were not interested in documenting the perspectives of Anishinaabe community members. What we have are fragments, oral accounts, preserved within the communities, occasional references in newspaper coverage that treated the indigenous presence in the district as a color note rather than as a substantive element of the story, and the testimony preserved in oral traditions that describe what was found and what was disturbed during those years. These accounts describe, among other things, the disturbance of sites whose significance was known to the communities but unknown to the mining operations. They describe the exposure, during mining operations, of features that community members recognized as connected to older activities in the same locations, and they describe a calculation that many community members made consciously, the calculation of what to say and what not to say, what to reveal and what to keep within the community's knowledge, given the demonstrated willingness of the new arrivals to take everything they found economically valuable and their demonstrated indifference to anything they found culturally significant. That calculation shaped what was shared with the mining operations and with the government. It continued to shape what was shared with subsequent generations of researchers. The gradual rebuilding of trust that has allowed some researchers to access traditional knowledge about the cobalt passages is the undoing of that calculation, not because the calculation was wrong given the context in which it was made, but because the context has changed enough that different calculations are now possible. There is a conversation that has not yet happened, at least not in any public forum, between the geological researchers who have the geophysical data and the community members who have the traditional knowledge, in a setting where both can be fully expressed without either being subordinated to the other. The conversations that have happened have been partial, shaped by the legal frameworks of consultation, the academic frameworks of ethical research review, and the pragmatic frameworks of researchers navigating institutional constraints. They have been valuable, and they have moved the investigation forward, but they have not been the open, extended conversation between different forms of knowledge that the question ultimately requires. That conversation will happen, if it happens, in the context of a research relationship that has been built over enough time to support it. Research relationships of that depth take years to build, require sustained institutional support, and depend on the accumulation of trust that comes from demonstrated respect for the knowledge and the knowledge holders. The researchers who are best positioned to facilitate that conversation are the ones who have been building those relationships quietly and without publicity for the past decade. The shield itself, the geological structure beneath the surface story, is approaching a moment of increasing pressure. The global demand for critical minerals, driven by the transition to electrified transportation and renewable energy generation, has focused intense attention on the Canadian Shield as a source of lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, and rare earth elements. The mining industry, government agencies, and international investors are all engaged in escalating efforts to find and develop new mineral deposits in the Shield using the most sophisticated geophysical methods available. These efforts will, inevitably, encounter pre-contact mining features. The geophysical technologies being deployed for mineral exploration are the same technologies that identified the cobalt embayment anomalies. Every new survey of a mineral-bearing area in the Shield is a potential discovery of pre-contact features, and the pace and intensity of survey activity is increasing rapidly. This creates both risk and opportunity. The risk is that pre-contact features will be encountered by exploration programs that have no framework for recognizing their significance and no incentive to report rather than discard what they find. The opportunity is that the volume of geophysical data being collected creates a new landscape of potential evidence that, if systematically examined with appropriate expertise, could substantially advance understanding of the extent and distribution of pre-contact mining across the Shield. Whether the risk or the opportunity dominates will depend on decisions made in the next few years about the regulatory and research frameworks that govern the new wave of mineral exploration. The story of the cobalt embayment passages is, at its core, a story about what we choose to look for and what we choose to see when we find it. The evidence has been available, in various forms, for as long as European researchers have been working in northern Ontario. The geophysical methods capable of identifying the passages have existed for decades. The archival sources that corroborate the geological data have been sitting in public archives. The traditional knowledge that describes and locates the features has been held by communities that have, in recent years, begun to share it with researchers prepared to take it seriously. What has been missing is not the evidence. What has been missing is the decision to look at it as a coherent whole, to ask the question that the evidence is capable of answering, and to organize the investigation that would answer it definitively. That decision is not made by any single institution or any single researcher. It is made collectively by the community of scholars and institutions, and communities and funding agencies, whose combined orientation determines what questions get asked and what evidence gets assembled. The community is changing, the orientation is shifting. The question is, finally, being asked in ways that create the possibility of a real answer. The passage network beneath Canada's oldest mines is a window, not into mystery for its own sake, but into a specific historical reality that has consequences for how we understand the pre-contact history of North America. That history is not a background to the European story. It is not a prelude to civilization arriving from across the ocean. It is a story in its own right, with its own complexity, its own sophistication, its own record of human ingenuity, applied to the specific conditions of a specific landscape over a specific and very long period of time. Reading that history requires tools that are only now becoming available, and partnerships that are only now becoming possible. But the history is there, written in the rock, preserved in the oral traditions, waiting in the archives, accumulating in the geophysical data of surveys whose purposes were never supposed to include it. The Shield holds many things. It has held the mineral wealth that built the Canadian economy. It has held the ecological systems that sustained the communities of the North for millennia. It has held the traces of human activity across a period so long that the recorded history of the region is a recent appendix. And it holds, beneath the oldest mines in the colonial record, older mines, made by people who understood the earth beneath their feet in ways that the colonial record has not yet found adequate terms to describe. The new scans found those mines. What we do with what the scans found is the next chapter of a story that is very much older than the scans. When you look at the map of northern Ontario and trace the line of the old mineral belt from cobalt in the east through Timmins to Sudbury in the west, you are tracing a geological structure that is among the most mineral-rich linear features on the surface of the planet. The Abitibi Greenstone Belt, which underlies this line, formed approximately 2.7 billion years ago during a period of intense volcanic activity that created and modified the rock types in which metallic mineral deposits concentrate. The gold at Timmins, the silver at Cobalt, the nickel and copper at Sudbury are not random occurrences. They are the product of geological processes that operated at a specific time on a specific structure, and they are concentrated along that structure in ways that make the belt as a whole a coherent geological and economic unit. Pre-contact communities working this territory would have understood it as a unit as well, not in the geological terms we use, but in the practical terms of where the valuable materials were and how they related to each other across the landscape. The knowledge base that allowed systematic extraction in the Cobalt district would have been part of a larger knowledge base that encompassed the entire belt, connecting the silver extraction of the east with the copper operations further west, and situating both within a geographic understanding of the Shield that was more detailed and comprehensive than anything European surveyors produced. Until the 20th century, this comprehensive knowledge is not preserved in any single document or any single community's oral tradition. It is distributed across communities whose territories cover different portions of the belt, preserved in fragments that individual researchers are working to assemble. The assembly is partial and incomplete, but the fragments that have been assembled are consistent with the picture of a comprehensive, organized knowledge system applied systematically across a mineral-bearing territory of continental significance. There is an aspect of pre-contact knowledge transmission that rarely receives attention in discussions of pre-contact mining, and that is the role of ceremony in knowledge preservation. In many North American indigenous traditions, practical knowledge of economically significant resources is encoded in ceremonial practice, in the protocols governing when and how extraction activities can begin, in the ritual observances that accompany extraction, in the narrative traditions that describe the relationship between the community and the materials they extract. This encoding is not arbitrary. It is a technology for ensuring that the knowledge survives and that it is transmitted accurately across generations. Ceremonial knowledge is subject to different pressures than purely practical knowledge. The disruption of ceremonial practice by missionary activity, residential schools, and the Indian Act was one of the most effective mechanisms through which colonial policy attacked the cultural continuity of indigenous communities, precisely because that disruption attacked not just the surface expressions of culture, but the transmission mechanisms for all the knowledge that culture encoded. The recovery of ceremonial practice that has occurred in many communities over the past several decades is not simply a cultural or spiritual matter. It is also a matter of knowledge recovery, the restoration of transmission mechanisms through which practical knowledge that had become inaccessible can once again be shared. The revival of ceremonies associated with mineral extraction and landscape management is, among other things, a process of recovering knowledge about those activities that the ceremonies encoded. This dimension of the cobalt story is the one that is least accessible to external researchers, and appropriately so. Ceremonial knowledge belongs to the communities that hold it, and decisions about what aspects of it to share with researchers and the public belong to those communities. But it is worth noting, for completeness, that the revival of ceremonial practice is part of the same process as the geological survey and the archival research, a multimodal recovery of knowledge about the deep history of the shield that is proceeding, unevenly and imperfectly, along multiple tracks simultaneously. The practical question of what the passages were used for, beyond the obvious answer of mineral extraction, is one that physical investigation could at least partially address. Passages used exclusively for mineral extraction would be expected to show certain characteristics: tool marks concentrated on the working face, debris from extraction concentrated near the face and in the primary passage, ventilation features concentrated near the deepest working areas, and a general absence of domestic material culture. Passages used for other purposes, in addition to or instead of extraction, would show different characteristics: evidence of fire use away from working faces, possibly the remains of organic material associated with non-extractive activities, possibly spatial organization that reflects uses other than the simple movement of workers and materials. Ancient mines in Europe that have been thoroughly investigated, like the Great Orme copper mines, show that underground spaces were used for multiple purposes, some related to extraction and some not. The deep chambers that require considerable effort to access often show evidence of uses, probably ceremonial or initiatory, that have nothing directly to do with getting ore out of the ground. The relationship between the practical and the ceremonial in the use of underground space is a theme in the archaeology of mining across multiple cultures and time periods. Whether a similar pattern holds in the cobalt passages is a question that cannot be answered without physical investigation. But the question is worth asking, and the answer, whatever it is, would add significantly to the picture of what pre-contact shield communities were doing underground and why. The relationship between the passages and water is another aspect of the question that merits attention. The shield is a landscape defined by water, by lakes and rivers and wetlands that cover enormous portions of its surface. Underground, the relationship with water is equally defining. The rock of the shield is not uniformly impermeable. It is cut by fracture systems along which groundwater moves, and the interaction between groundwater and ore-bearing minerals is responsible for many of the secondary mineral formations that are characteristic of shield deposits. Pre-contact miners working in the shield would have encountered water underground, possibly in significant quantities. The management of water in underground workings is one of the most persistent challenges of mining in the Shield, and the industrial mines of the late 19th and early 20th centuries invested enormously in pumping systems to manage it. Pre-contact miners without pumping technology would have had to manage water by choice of location, selecting working areas where the water table was below the planned depth of extraction, or by timing, conducting deep work during dry periods when the water table was lowest, or by drainage engineering, cutting drainage passages that allowed water to flow away from the working areas by gravity. The last of these options is particularly significant. Drainage passages that function by gravity require sophisticated understanding of the three-dimensional geometry of the underground space, because a drainage passage that does not maintain the correct grade relative to the working areas will not function as intended. Getting this right in hard rock, without the ability to survey with precision instruments, requires either a very detailed understanding of the local geology or a great deal of trial and error, or both. Evidence of drainage engineering in the cobalt passages, if the passages are investigated physically, would be among the most compelling evidence for sophisticated planning, because drainage passages serve no purpose other than managing water, and their existence would indicate that the construction of the passage network included infrastructure designed to enable long-term, sustained use of deep working areas. The question of what happened to the extracted material, the silver and copper that would have been removed from the passages, is also worth considering. In the case of the old copper complex sites in Michigan, the extracted copper is, in principle, traceable in the archaeological record. The tools, ornaments, and other objects produced from it appear in burial contexts and habitation sites across the continent. But the quantities of copper that appear in the archaeological record represent only a fraction of what was produced, because most objects eventually corrode, are recycled, or are lost in contexts that do not preserve them. For silver, the situation is more complex. Silver is rarer than copper in the archaeological record of pre-contact North America, not necessarily because it was rarer in production, but because silver objects, being less robust than copper objects, survive less well in the archaeological record, and because silver, as a material of high value, was probably recycled rather than deposited in ways that would preserve it. The apparent scarcity of silver in the pre-contact archaeological record may reflect preservation bias as much as production reality. Trace element analysis of the silver that does appear in pre-contact contexts could, in principle, identify whether cobalt silver was present in the pre-contact trade. The analytical methods for doing this are well established. The relevant objects are in institutional collections that are, in principle, accessible for sampling. The missing element again is a coordinated research program that asks this question systematically rather than in isolated, small-scale studies. The wider world of underground heritage is instructive about what is possible when institutions commit to investigating pre-industrial mining at depth. The Almaden mercury mines in Spain, the Falun copper mine in Sweden, the Great Orme mines in Wales, the Hallstatt salt mines in Austria. These are all examples of pre-industrial underground extraction that has been investigated thoroughly enough to be included in UNESCO's World Heritage List as examples of human cultural achievement of outstanding universal value. The investigation that produced this recognition was expensive, sustained, and multidisciplinary. It was also, in each case, the product of institutional commitment at the national level, funded by governments that considered the history significant enough to invest in understanding it. Canada has not made an equivalent commitment to understanding the pre-contact underground heritage of the Shield. The recognition framework for this heritage does not yet exist in Canadian policy. The research programs that would support that recognition have not been funded at the necessary scale. The collaborative frameworks that would allow the investigation to proceed with full Indigenous participation have been established in some contexts, but not specifically for this purpose. These are not immovable constraints. They are policy choices, made and remade continuously by institutions whose priorities can change. The question of whether the pre-contact mining heritage of the Canadian Shield will receive the institutional commitment that comparable heritage has received in Europe is a question about Canadian public values, about whose history counts as significant enough to invest in understanding, and about the relationship between the Canadian state and the Indigenous nations whose ancestors created that heritage. These are not comfortable questions, but they are the right ones. Every survey, every archival search, every conversation with an elder, every geological analysis adds one more data point to a picture that is becoming clearer but is not yet complete. The incompleteness is not a reason to withhold judgment indefinitely. The evidence that exists is sufficient to support a strong provisional conclusion, the kind of conclusion that drives further investigation rather than waiting for certainty before acting. The provisional conclusion is this: the Canadian Shield was the site of organized, deep, sustained pre-contact mining, conducted by sophisticated communities within elaborate trade and exchange networks, using technologies that were effective without being European, and within institutional frameworks that transmitted knowledge and organized collective labor across many generations. The passage network identified in the cobalt embayment is the best documented example of this activity, but it is unlikely to be the only example. This conclusion is not certain. It may be modified by future research, but it is supported by a convergent body of evidence from multiple independent sources, and it is consistent with everything that is known about the organizational capacity of pre-contact Great Lakes societies. The default assumption that deep organized extraction did not occur, an assumption that has never been well supported by evidence, and that has always been grounded more in general preconceptions about pre-contact societies than in specific investigation of the Shield, is no longer defensible as a working hypothesis. The international community of archaeologists and geoscientists who study pre-industrial mining is larger and more active than most people outside the field realize. Annual conferences bring together researchers from dozens of countries who are working on similar questions in very different geological and cultural contexts. The exchange of methods, interpretive frameworks, and comparative data at these conferences is one of the mechanisms through which the field advances beyond the limitations of individual national research programs. Canadian researchers working on the Shield mining question have been participants in these international discussions, and the comparative perspective they have gained from engaging with research on European and African pre-industrial mining has been important in shaping their approaches to the Shield material. The Great Orme analogy, which provides a documented example of organized deep mining without steel tools at roughly comparable antiquity, was not an obvious comparison until researchers engaged with the international literature and found it there. The international community has also been interested in the Shield data because it represents a type of pre-industrial mining in a geological and cultural context that is not well represented in the existing international literature. If the cobalt embayment passages are confirmed as pre-contact artificial features, the published documentation of the Shield mining tradition would be a significant contribution to the global understanding of pre-industrial mining as a human phenomenon. The students who are currently in graduate programs in geology, archaeology, and related fields across Canadian universities will be the researchers who carry this investigation forward in the coming decades. Some of them are already working on aspects of the question, drawn to it by the combination of genuine scientific interest and the sense that the conventional accounts of the Shield's human history are inadequate. They are developing the methods, the partnerships, and the institutional relationships that will make serious investigation possible. The pace at which this generation advances the investigation will depend partly on factors they cannot control: the funding environment, the institutional priorities of their universities and funding agencies, the pace of legal and policy change in the area of Indigenous rights. But it will also depend on factors they can influence: the quality of their research, the credibility of their partnerships with Indigenous communities, and their success in communicating to broader audiences why the question matters. The question matters because the history of the Canadian Shield is the history of the land that the Canadian nation occupies, and the fullness of that history cannot be understood without taking seriously the tens of thousands of years that preceded European arrival. A nation that knows only 2% of the history of its territory is a nation with a very limited understanding of where it is. The concept of a heritage landscape, a landscape whose significance lies not in any single feature, but in the accumulated human engagement with it over a long period, is one that Canadian heritage law has been slow to develop, but that the Shield demands. The Cobalt District and the broader Abitibi Belt are heritage landscapes in this sense. Their significance lies not just in the industrial mining of the 20th century or the geological wealth of the Shield Formation, but in the entire history of human engagement with the mineral resources of the region, from the first people who recognized the value of the copper and silver in the outcrops, to the engineers who sank the shafts of the industrial era. A heritage landscape framework would require recognizing the pre-contact mining activity as a component of the region's heritage value, alongside and intertwined with the industrial heritage that current frameworks acknowledge. It would require engaging the indigenous nations, whose territories encompass the landscape, as co-stewards of that heritage, not as stakeholders to be consulted, but as rights holders with substantive authority over how the heritage is researched, documented, and protected. This framework does not currently exist in Canadian heritage law. Building it would require political will, legislative change, and the kind of sustained engagement between government, industry, academic institutions, and Indigenous nations that Canadian institutions have found difficult to sustain over the timescales that heritage protection requires. The passages beneath the Cobalt District will not wait forever for that framework to be built. They are, as underground features go, well preserved. But they are not invulnerable, and the intensifying economic pressure on the mineral resources of the Shield creates real risks of encounter without recognition, investigation without protection, and discovery without understanding. There is something worth saying about the experience of sitting with a question like this one, a question whose answer is partially visible, but not yet fully assembled, whose significance is large but not yet widely acknowledged, whose implications are understood by a small community of specialists and almost no one else. The experience is one of sustained attention to something that most of the world is not paying attention to, which has its own kind of weight. The researchers who are carrying this question forward are doing so in the context of academic careers that reward published conclusions more than long-term investigations of difficult questions, in institutional environments that are more comfortable with well-defined projects than with open-ended investigations of uncertain scope, and in a funding environment that is more responsive to economic applications than to the kind of historical research that the Cobalt question represents. That they are continuing the investigation anyway, and that they are doing so with increasing rigor and in increasingly credible partnerships with the communities whose history is at stake, is a demonstration of the kind of commitment to knowledge that serious historical investigation requires. The history of the Canadian Shield is worth knowing. The people who are working to know it are doing something genuinely important, in conditions that make it genuinely difficult. The passages are waiting, the evidence is accumulating, the investigation is proceeding, slowly and carefully, in the manner appropriate to a question of this significance. The result, when it comes, will be worth the wait. There is a phrase that recurs in the oral traditions of several Great Lakes communities when they speak of the underground world, a phrase that translates, approximately, as the place where the earth knows itself. The phrase locates knowledge in the earth itself, not in the people who enter it, as if the underground is not just a place where things are found, but a place where things are understood, where the relationship between the surface world and the deep world becomes perceptible. This is not a description that European-trained geologists would use for the underground, but it is not inconsistent with what geologists know. The underground is where the processes that created the surface world are preserved in their most direct form, where the temperatures and pressures of deep geological history are recorded in the minerals, where the structures that control the surface are visible in their three-dimensional form, where the long timescales of geological change are laid out in sequences of rock that are, to a trained reader, legible as history. Pre-contact miners, who spent extended periods underground, following ore bodies by the light of stone lamps or fire, developing an intimate sensory familiarity with the character of different rock types, learning to distinguish productive rock from barren rock by touch and smell, and the sound it made when struck, were engaging with the underground in ways that, while not geological in the formal sense, produced a kind of knowledge of the earth that the phrase from the oral traditions describes accurately. The passages of the Cobalt embayment were, among other things, a way of going to the place where the earth knows itself, and the people who made them were going there not just to extract silver and copper, but to engage with the earth in a relationship whose full character is not captured by the economic dimension alone. Understanding that relationship, in all its dimensions, is part of what the investigation of the passages is ultimately about. The last thing to say, before this story pauses at the edge of what is currently known and waits for the investigation that will extend it, is something about the nature of the question itself. This is a question about what people did, a very long time ago, in a specific place, with specific materials and specific knowledge. It is not a mystical question. It is not a question about ancient aliens, or lost civilizations, or any of the other frameworks that popular culture has developed for explaining pre-contact evidence that does not fit the standard account. It is a straightforward historical question. Did the pre-contact communities of the Canadian Shield engage in organized deep mining of silver and copper in the Cobalt District and related areas? And if so, to what extent, for how long, and with what organizational structures? The evidence suggests the answer to the first part is yes. The evidence for the remaining parts is partial and requires further investigation to make complete. This is the kind of question that archaeology is designed to answer, using the methods that have been developed over a century of practice for recovering and interpreting the material traces of past human behavior. The specific application of those methods to the pre-contact shield mining question requires adaptations, new tools, new partnerships, new frameworks, but it is archaeology in the most fundamental sense, the systematic investigation of the human past through its physical remains. The physical remains are there. They have been there all along. The investigation that will make sense of them is, finally, beginning to be organized. The history that investigation will reveal is the history of the Earth beneath the oldest mines in Canada, and it is deeper, older, and more significant than the surface story has ever acknowledged. That is what the new scans found, and that is why it matters. The communities of the Cobalt District and the surrounding shield have been living with this question for much longer than the researchers who are now asking it formally. For the Anishinaabe families whose grandparents worked as guides and laborers for the Silver Rush operations, for the elders who heard stories of what the ground contained before the railway came, for the young people who are now being trained in both indigenous knowledge systems and Western scientific methods, and who carry the capacity to bridge the two, the question of what lies beneath the old mines is not abstract. It is a piece of living history, present in the landscape they inhabit and in the knowledge their communities have maintained against considerable pressure to abandon it. This living quality of the question is one of the things that distinguishes it from the academic debates that surround it. The academic debate is about evidence, methodology, and interpretation. The community conversation is about identity, heritage, and the relationship between knowledge and power. These two conversations are related, but not identical, and the challenge for researchers who want to work seriously in this space is to engage with both without conflating them. The best researchers who are working on the shield mining question have learned to hold this complexity, to be rigorous about the evidence while being attentive to the social and political dimensions of the investigation, to be honest about what the evidence shows while being respectful of knowledge that the evidence alone cannot access, and to be committed to advancing understanding while accepting that the community's relationship to its own history takes precedence over the Academy's interest in producing knowledge. There is a particular moment in the process of investigating difficult historical questions when the accumulated evidence crosses a threshold. Before the threshold, the evidence is interesting but not compelling, suggestive but not convincing, sufficient to motivate further investigation, but not sufficient to ground confident conclusions. After the threshold, the evidence is compelling enough that the burden of proof shifts. It is no longer sufficient to simply note that the question is open. One must now actively argue against the emerging conclusion to avoid the inference it supports. The cobalt embayment evidence is, in the judgment of the researchers most familiar with it, approaching that threshold. The geophysical data alone might not cross it. The archival data alone might not cross it. The traditional knowledge alone, given the institutional resistance to treating it as evidence, certainly would not cross it on its own. But the convergence of all of these, reinforced by the comparative context of the old copper complex and the international context of pre-industrial mining research, brings the evidence to a point where dismissal requires active argument rather than passive skepticism. The researchers who are making that argument for dismissal are not numerous, and their arguments tend to rest on the absence of the specific evidence that only physical investigation could provide, rather than on positive evidence that the anomalies are natural or that the passages do not exist. Absence of physical investigation is not evidence of absence of the passages. It is evidence that physical investigation has not yet been conducted, which is itself a statement about institutional priorities rather than about geological reality. The mapping of the shield's pre-contact mining heritage, if it is ever undertaken systematically, will require a kind of institutional continuity that Canadian research programs do not currently provide. Individual research grants fund work for 3 to 5 years, often less. Doctoral programs produce researchers over 6 to 8 years, who then disperse into the job market and may or may not continue working on the questions their thesis addressed. The sustained, multi-decade programs of investigation that would be required to map the full extent of pre-contact mining across the Shield do not fit the standard funding and career structures of Canadian academic research. The models that exist for this kind of sustained investigation in other countries and in other disciplinary contexts involve either very long-term government programs, the kind that national geological surveys conduct over decades with stable core funding, or the institutional continuity of Indigenous community research programs, which can maintain focus on specific questions across generations because the communities themselves persist and their interest in their own history persists with them. A combination of these models, a government-funded research program built in genuine partnership with Indigenous community research institutions, would have the continuity and the legitimacy that the shield mining question requires. Such a combination is not unprecedented in Canadian science. The long-term ecological monitoring programs that have been established in the Arctic, in collaboration with Inuit communities, provide a model. Adapting that model to the archaeological investigation of pre-contact mining would require political will and institutional creativity, but the model exists and has been proven to work. The shield has a quality, in certain seasons and in certain lights, of absolute geological permanence. The rock looks as if nothing could disturb it, as if the events of human history, however significant they seem from inside the human timescale, are simply too small to leave a mark on formations that have survived 2.5 billion years of everything the planet could throw at them. This quality is, in some ways, comforting. It suggests a stability, a continuity, a persistence that human institutions rarely achieve. But it is also misleading. The shield has been profoundly changed by human activity in the past century and a half, at the surface and below it. The industrial mining operations that penetrated it at Cobalt, Timmins, Sudbury, and dozens of other locations left physical marks that will be visible in the geological record for millions of years. The voids left by extracted ore, the contamination of groundwater and surface water, the landscape modifications at every mine site. These marks are small relative to the age of the shield, but they are real and they are permanent. The pre-contact marks are also real and also permanent, but they are smaller, less visible, and less contaminating than the industrial marks. The passages of the cobalt embayment are, from the perspective of the shield's geological longevity, barely detectable scars in the surface of a formation that has been accumulating geological experience for incomprehensibly longer. But, from the perspective of human history, they are enormous. They are the evidence of an organized, sustained, multi-generational industry that operated in this landscape long before the first European surveyor put a line on a map. Both perspectives are true simultaneously. The shield holds both the geological permanence and the human history without contradiction, because geology and human history operate on such different timescales that they do not compete with each other for significance. They simply coexist, layered, the human marks superimposed on the geological marks providing the conditions that made the human activities possible. The final element of this investigation that deserves attention is the one that is most difficult to discuss in the language of academic research. The question of what the communities that made the passages felt about what they were doing. The motivation for economic activity, even in societies organized very differently from modern capitalist economies, is never purely economic. The extraction of silver and copper from the earth was embedded in cultural systems, in cosmological frameworks, in social institutions that gave it meaning beyond the practical value of the materials extracted. What did it mean, in the cultural context of the pre-contact shield communities, to go underground? What relationship did the underground have to the surface world, to the spiritual landscape, to the social organization of the community? What rituals governed entry and exit? What understandings about the nature of the earth and the material? They require the kind of knowledge that only the communities themselves possess in their traditions and their ceremonies and their stories. Some fragments of answers exist in the ethnographic literature, in the careful work of researchers who, over the past several decades, have listened to what community members were willing to share about the relationship between people and earth, between extraction and reciprocity, between taking from the ground and giving something back. These fragments suggest a framework in which extraction was not a simple economic transaction, but a relationship, governed by obligations on both sides, between people and the materials they took from the earth. That framework is not inconsistent with sustained, organized, large-scale extraction. It is consistent with a kind of extraction that was attentive to the conditions of its own continuity, that understood the relationship between present extraction and future availability, and that organized its activities accordingly. Whether the specific practices of the cobalt mining tradition reflected this framework is a question that only deeper engagement with community knowledge can address. But the framework itself suggests that the people who made the passages were thinking about what they were doing in ways that go well beyond the simple economics of extraction. That complexity is part of the story. The passages were not made by simple people with simple motivations. They were made by people with a relationship to the earth that we do not yet fully understand, and that relationship is part of what the investigation of the passages is ultimately trying to recover. The rock waits, the passages wait, the evidence waits, the communities that carry the oldest knowledge wait, and the investigation, piece by piece, year by year, moves toward the moment when enough is known to tell the full story. That moment has not yet arrived, but it is closer than it has ever been. The shield in late autumn has a color that is specific to it, and that visitors from other landscapes find difficult to describe. The greens of summer are gone, the brief gold of early autumn is gone. What remains is a palette of grey and brown and dull red, the color of exposed rock and dead vegetation and water that has stopped reflecting the bright sky of summer and has gone dark and still. In the towns along the mineral belt, this palette is interrupted by the rust and orange of oxidizing metal, the tailings ponds, the old headframes, the scattered equipment of an industry that expanded furiously and contracted painfully over the course of the 20th century. In this landscape, the underground represents something fundamentally different from the surface, a constancy, a temperature, and a darkness that do not change with the season, a space that is insulated from the weather that defines the surface world and that has defined it, in the human experience of the shield, for as long as people have been here. Going underground in northern Ontario is, in the most literal physical sense, escaping the climate, and in a region where the climate is extreme enough to be a defining fact of life for 8 months of the year, that escape has always had significance beyond the practical. The industrial miners who went underground in the cobalt district in the early 20th century were escaping, in this sense, the brutal winters above. The pre-contact miners who went underground in the same district were escaping the same winters. The experience of being underground, of being in a space where the temperature is constant and the wind does not reach, was an experience they shared, separated by centuries and by every other dimension of their existence, but sharing that specific physical reality. The earth below the frost line is the same earth for all of them, patient and dark and constant at 4 degrees Celsius regardless of what the surface is doing. The investigation of pre-contact mining is, in one sense, an investigation of the limits of what archaeology can know. The evidence is partial, the conditions for investigation are complex. The interpretive frameworks are contested. The communities whose history is at stake have claims that complicate simple academic investigation. All of these factors constrain what can be established with confidence and on what timescale. But the limits are not absolute. They are the limits of current knowledge, current methods, current institutional arrangements, and current political will. Each of these can change, and each of them is changing. The methods are improving. The institutional arrangements are evolving. The political will, while still inadequate to the scale of the investigation required, is growing. And the knowledge, which is the only thing that does not simply improve with investment, but requires the active, sustained engagement of researchers with evidence, is accumulating steadily. The history of the Canadian Shield is becoming knowable in ways it was not knowable even a decade ago. The technology to find the evidence exists. The frameworks to interpret it are being developed. The partnerships to give the investigation legitimacy are being built. And the evidence, patient and permanent, in the rock, is waiting. The passages beneath Canada's oldest mines are there. The investigation that will confirm them and explain them is underway. The history they represent, older and richer and more complex than the official account has yet acknowledged, is beginning to be told. And this, as much as anything, is why the story matters. The archives of the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway, preserved in the Archives of Ontario, contain the operational records of the line that opened the Cobalt District to industrial exploitation. Among these records are the surveyor's field books from the original route survey conducted in the years immediately before construction began. These field books are extraordinarily detailed, recording every significant geological and topographic feature the survey encountered, because the surveyors were looking for conditions that would affect construction and operation. Several of the field books include notes on features that the surveyors found puzzling, features that do not correspond to any category of natural geological occurrence, and that do not appear to have been created by any prior human activity that the surveyors recognized. One surveyor, in a field book dated to the summer of the railway's initial survey season, describes finding, on a hillside, that the planned route would traverse what he calls depressions of regular form, spaced at intervals that suggest intentional placement. He notes that the depressions appear to be the surface expressions of underground openings, that they show no evidence of recent human origin, and that the surrounding rock shows oxidation patterns consistent with long-term exposure of a previously subsurface surface. He does not pursue the observation further. The next entry in the field book returns to grade calculations and soil descriptions. The depressions are not mentioned again, but they were there, and a surveyor noticed them, and he recorded what he saw with the precision that professional surveyors cultivate, and the record survives in the archive. These depressions, if they could be located on the ground, might be the surface expressions of the same system that the ground-penetrating radar has identified underground. The railway survey was conducted along a route that passes through the region of the Cobalt Embayment, where the geophysical anomalies are concentrated. The hillside features the surveyor describes, spaced at regular intervals and showing underground connections, are what you would expect to find at the surface above a connected underground passage network that has partially collapsed or degraded near the surface over a long period of time. This connection between the 1901 field book and the 2021 geophysical survey, spanning a century of records and representing entirely independent lines of evidence, is exactly the kind of convergence that drives serious historical investigation. Neither source alone is conclusive. Together, they begin to close the circle. The act of going back, of looking at old records with new questions and finding answers that the original recorders did not know they were providing, is one of the most productive forms of historical investigation. Archives accumulate the evidence of their time without knowing what future questions will be asked of them. The records that survive do not survive because they were selected for their relevance to questions not yet formulated. They survive by institutional accident, by the randomness of preservation, by the choices of archivists who were managing storage rather than curating for future researchers. This means that archives are full of answers to questions that have not yet been asked, and that the act of asking a new question of an old archive often produces results that are both surprising and illuminating. The field book with the surveyor's depressions, the Department of Indian Affairs report with the hand-dug passages, the mine manager's letters asking about pre-industrial features underground. All of these were waiting in the archives for someone to ask the question that would make them relevant. The systematic search of relevant archives for references to pre-contact features in the Canadian Shield mining districts is a research project that has not yet been funded or conducted at the necessary scale. A targeted archival search, organized around the specific question of pre-contact mining features and covering the major relevant collections in Ontario and federal archives, would be one of the most cost-effective investments available in this investigation. The archival sources are preserved, accessible, and waiting. The question that would make them speak has been formulated. The research program that would conduct the search has not yet been organized. There is a young Anishinaabe geologist, trained at a Canadian university, who has been working quietly at the intersection of her professional training and her community's traditional knowledge of the Shield. She is not a prominent figure in the geological literature and has not published the work she is doing in any form that would make it visible to researchers outside her immediate network. But within that network, she is known as someone who has been quietly correlating the geological knowledge encoded in traditional stories and practices with the published geological record of the Shield and finding, with a consistency that she describes as startling, that the traditional knowledge describes geological features accurately. She is not alone. There is a small cohort of indigenous scientists in Canada working across geology, ecology, hydrology, and related disciplines who are engaged in similar work, bringing the systematic rigor of Western scientific training to the task of documenting and validating the scientific content of indigenous traditional knowledge. Their work is producing results that are not yet widely known outside specialist circles, but that are beginning to appear in the peer-reviewed literature and that are quietly transforming the way their fields think about the relationship between indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. For the question of pre-contact shield mining, this cohort represents a resource that has not yet been fully engaged. Their ability to work across the knowledge system boundary, to understand both the geological evidence and the traditional knowledge that bears on it, makes them uniquely positioned to contribute to an investigation that requires exactly this kind of bridging. Engaging them with appropriate support and in appropriate relationships would accelerate the investigation significantly. The story of the cobalt embayment passages is not finished. It is in some ways just beginning to be told in the forms that the contemporary world uses to tell stories. Peer-reviewed papers, geophysical surveys, archival research programs, collaborative research partnerships. The older telling, in the traditional knowledge of the Shield communities, has been continuous. The two tellings are converging, slowly, on a common account of something that happened in the rock beneath the Northern Ontario landscape a very long time ago. That convergence is the most important thing happening in this investigation, and it is worth waiting to see where it leads. What remains to be said, at this point in the investigation, is something about patience. Historical investigation of this kind requires a patience that does not come naturally to institutions organized around annual budgets, 3-year grants, and publication timelines. It requires the willingness to work with incomplete evidence for long periods, to resist the temptation to claim certainty before certainty is warranted, and to maintain the kind of open, exploratory engagement with the question that produces genuine discovery rather than the confirmation of prior conclusions. The researchers who have carried this investigation forward to its present state have demonstrated that patience. The communities that have maintained their knowledge of the Shield's underground history across centuries of disruption and suppression have demonstrated it in a far more profound sense. The rock itself, indifferent to the patience or impatience of the people investigating it, has simply been there, as it has been for 2.7 billion years, holding its secrets with geological equanimity. The secrets are beginning to come out, slowly, carefully, through the convergence of evidence from multiple directions. The shape of the underground history of the Canadian Shield is becoming visible. The passages are real, the people who made them were real, the history they represent is real, and the investigation that will establish all of this, definitively and publicly, is the work of the years ahead. The Shield is patient. The investigation can afford to be patient too. The light that does reach underground comes from fire, from electric lamps carried by workers, from the brief flash of a camera documenting a feature found in the dark. Each of these lights reveals a portion of what is there and leaves the rest in shadow. The full picture requires many lights, many investigators, many visits to the same space from different angles. The cobalt embayment passages have not yet had their lights. They have had the indirect illumination of geophysical surveys, the reflected glow of archival records, the transmitted knowledge of traditional accounts. These are all real lights, but they are lights that reach the passages from outside, through the medium of geology and history and oral tradition, rather than through direct physical presence. The direct light will come. When it does, what it illuminates will add to the picture that the indirect lights have been building. The history of the Canadian Shield, in its fullness and its depth, is worth the effort required to bring it into the light. The question asked by the new scans is not merely geological. It is a question about memory, about the persistence of human knowledge through catastrophe, about what survives when the people who made something are gone, and only the thing they made remains in the dark. The passages survive because rock survives. The knowledge of what they are survives because knowledge, carried in oral tradition and ceremony, and the practice of people who refuse to let it die, is more durable than the institutions that tried to extinguish it. The two forms of survival are converging now, in the surveys, and the stories, and the slow, careful work of understanding what the earth beneath the oldest mines in Canada has been holding, in silence, for a very long time. The investigation continues. The rock remembers. The passages wait. And somewhere in the silence between the old knowledge and the new instruments, the history of what people did beneath the oldest mines in Canada is beginning to speak in a language that both traditions can finally hear. The shield has been here longer than any question we can ask of it. It will be here long after the question is answered. What changes is us, our understanding, our willingness to look at the evidence without flinching, our capacity to hold the full complexity of a history that is larger and older and more human than the simple story has ever allowed. The passages are there. The story they tell is true, and it belongs to everyone who lives in this land and to the people whose ancestors made it. The earth below the frost line holds what the surface has forgotten, always.